"Help me! The brakes are broken!" Margaret Whitmore screamed in terror. Both of her hands flew up as the wheelchair began to slide down the gentle slope. The brakes won't hold." Annie Carter had just stepped out of the linen room, carrying a neatly folded stack of towels in her arms. For a moment, she froze. Then the towels slipped from her hands and scattered across the floor. "Ma'am, hold on," Annie shouted. She ran. Annie's shoes slid against the tile floor. The wheelchair had already rolled halfway down the slope, wobbling as if it had lost control. One wheel shook violently, as though something underneath had come loose. Margaret twisted in the chair, trying to look behind her. "Please," Margaret cried. "I can't stop." "I'm coming," Annie said, her voice already breathless. She reached the wheelchair and grabbed both handles from behind. The force nearly threw her off her feet. The wheelchair jerked hard, tilted to one side, and kept sliding. Annie dug her heels into the tile, both arms straining as she tried to pull it back. For one brief second, she thought she had it. The chair slowed. Margaret leaned to one side, gripping the armrest, her entire body stiff with fear. Annie tightened her hold, trying to keep the wheelchair steady, but the wheel slipped again. The right brake clicked uselessly, loose and weak. Then the wheelchair lurched forward. "No, no," Annie cried. The chair would not stop. It dragged her with it. Annie stumbled, caught her balance, then stumbled again. Her hip struck the wall, but she did not let go. The glass doors and the low wall near the garden entrance were now too close. If the chair crashed into them, Margaret could be thrown forward. At her age, one bad fall could change everything. Annie stopped trying to pull the wheelchair back. She took the risk. One of her hands shot forward and caught Margaret's wrist. "Ma'am, look at me," Annie said. "Look at me. Give me your hand." Margaret's eyes were wide with terror. "I'm going to fall. I've got you. Give me your hand." The wheelchair swayed again. Margaret reached out with a trembling hand. Annie grabbed it and held those cold fingers tightly. "Now lean toward me," Annie said. "Don't look down. Just look at me." "I can't." "Yes, you can. Please lean toward me." The wheelchair was almost at the bottom of the slope. Annie ran alongside it, partly pulled by the speed of the wheels. Her foot slipped so hard that her knee nearly hit the floor, but she forced herself upright. With one hand holding Margaret's wrist and the other wrapped around the woman's back, Annie pulled with all her strength. Margaret screamed as her body lifted out of the wheelchair. Annie turned, using her shoulder and hip to take the fall. Both women hit the floor, but Annie kept her arms around Margaret, shielding the older woman from the hardest impact. The wheelchair, now empty, kept racing forward. It rolled down the last stretch of the slope, slammed into the rubber stopper near the garden doors, bounced, tipped sharply to one side, and crashed into the wall. One wheel spun wildly in the air, slowed, and finally stopped. Margaret leaned against Annie, gasping, her whole body still shaking with fear. Annie's shoulder throbbed from the fall, but she paid no attention to herself. Her eyes stayed fixed on the woman in her arms. "Ma'am, are you hurt anywhere?" At first, Margaret did not answer. She placed one hand on her chest and stared at the wheelchair lying on its side at the bottom of the slope. Slowly, she drew in one trembling breath, then another. I'm all right," she whispered. Annie gently helped her sit up. "Don't move too fast, just keep breathing." Margaret nodded, her hands still shaking. Her fingers found Annie's sleeve and held on tightly. Margaret swallowed hard. "I thought I was going straight through those doors." "You're safe now," Annie said. The older woman closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Her face was still pale, but a little calm had returned. She looked at Annie as if she were trying to understand why a stranger had appeared at the exact moment she needed one. "You saved me," Margaret said. Before Annie could answer, footsteps pounded against the hallway floor. A man in a brown coat arrived first, followed by a woman holding a paper coffee cup and 2 medical staff members from the nurses' station. "Oh my God, ma'am. Are you all right?" the woman asked, crouching near Margaret but not daring to touch her. "Someone call a nurse," the man said, though his phone was already in his hand, and he seemed more interested in recording the scene than helping. One of the medical staff looked down the slope toward the overturned wheelchair. "How did this happen?" "The chair started sliding," Annie said, still breathing hard. "The brakes wouldn't hold." The woman with the coffee cup frowned at Annie. "You pulled her out while it was still moving?" "I had to. That was dangerous," the man said. "You could have made her fall even worse." Annie looked up at him. The chair was already going down the slope. "But you were supposed to stop the wheelchair, not pull someone out of it," he said with the confidence of a person who had not had to make the decision in the moment of danger. "She's lucky she's all right." Another guest, an older man, nodded slightly. "He's right. You cannot just pull an elderly woman out like that." What if she had broken a bone? Annie's cheeks flushed. "I tried to stop the chair," Annie said, "but it wouldn't stop." "You should have called staff," the woman said. Annie let out a short breath, almost laughing in disbelief. "There was no time." "Even so," the man with the phone muttered, "this could have been handled better." Annie turned to look at him. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear. "If all of you knew how to save her, why didn't anyone run?" The man lowered his phone. Annie looked from one face to another. "You saw her. You heard her yelling that the brakes were broken. You stood there and watched the wheelchair roll down the slope. Now that she is safe, you want to tell me what I should have done?" No one answered. Margaret's hand tightened around Annie's sleeve. "She saved me," Margaret said, her voice stronger this time. "That is what happened." The woman with the coffee cup shifted her weight and looked away. "I was going to find help," she said. "I didn't want to make things worse." The man in the brown coat pushed his phone into his pocket. "I was on a call. I didn't realize how serious it was until the chair was already halfway down." "You heard her scream," Annie said. He frowned, embarrassment flickering across his face. "Listen, I'm not trained for this." One of the medical staff cleared her throat. "We were coming from the nurses' station. We didn't see it until the chair was already moving very fast." "But you saw enough to tell me what I did wrong," Annie replied. The older man raised both hands slightly. "Young lady, no one is attacking you." Annie looked at him, then at Margaret. Her breathing had finally become steadier, but Margaret's hand was still trembling against her sleeve. "Maybe you don't call it attacking," Annie said, "but she was scared, and I was the only person close enough to do something. If I did not do it perfectly, I accept that. But I did not stand there and watch." The argument ended there. The woman with the coffee cup mumbled something about getting help and quickly walked toward the nurse's station. The man in the brown coat glanced once more at the overturned wheelchair, then turned and disappeared down the hallway. The older man followed after him. Within moments, the small crowd was gone. The hallway grew quiet again. Only Annie and Margaret remained seated on the cold floor near the edge of the slope, with the towels scattered behind them and the empty wheelchair lying at the bottom like proof of what most people had chosen to ignore. Margaret let out a long breath. People always have instructions after the danger has passed. Annie gave a tired smile. "Yes, ma'am, they do." "You were scared too," Margaret said. Annie hesitated. "A little." "A lot," Margaret gently corrected. Annie lowered her head. "I just didn't want you to get hurt." Margaret quietly studied her face. There was no suspicion in her eyes. No judgment. None of the quick, dismissive looks Annie had grown used to in hospital corridors. The older woman looked at Annie as if she had already decided what kind of person she was. "What is your name, sweetheart?" "Annie, Mom. Annie Carter." "Annie Carter," Margaret repeated slowly, as if placing the name somewhere safe in her memory. "I will remember that name." Annie tried to stand, but stopped when Margaret's hand tightened around her sleeve again. "Don't go yet," Margaret said. "I won't," Annie replied. "Not until someone takes you to be checked." Margaret nodded. Her eyes moved toward the wheelchair at the bottom of the slope. "My son was standing right there," she said softly. "He stepped away to take a phone call. Only for a moment." Annie did not know what to say to that. "I'm sure he'll be back soon." Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "He always comes back. The problem is, he always leaves too." Annie reached for the blanket that had slipped from Margaret's knees and gently pulled it back into place. "Are you cold?" "A little." Annie adjusted the blanket around her legs. "I'll stay with you." Margaret's eyes softened. "You say that as if it is a small thing." "Staying? Staying when someone is afraid." Annie had no answer. She simply sat beside Margaret on the cool hospital floor. At the bottom of the slope, the wheelchair remained still. The brakes had failed. The people around them had hesitated. But Annie had run. Richard Whitmore stepped out from around the corner, his phone still in his hand. His face was tense from the business call, the kind of call he had always considered important enough to make other people wait. He spoke quietly into the phone, one finger pressed to his ear so he could hear better, until his eyes landed on the empty space near the garden doors. the place where he had left his mother waiting. Richard stopped speaking mid-sentence. The phone slipped a few inches away from his ear. He did not see his mother. In an instant, the calm on his face disappeared. Richard hurried down the hallway, his eyes searching everywhere. Finally, he saw his mother sitting on the floor beside a young black woman. "Mom?" he shouted, rushing toward her. Margaret turned to look at him. "Richard." He dropped to one knee in front of her. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I was frightened, but I'm not hurt," Margaret said, though her hand was still gripping Annie's sleeve. The wheelchair rolled away. The brakes wouldn't hold. Richard looked toward the wheelchair lying on its side at the bottom of the slope. "I locked the brakes." "I know you thought you did." Richard's jaw tightened. That small correction seemed to strike him harder than a direct accusation. "Did you hit your head? Your hip?" "No. This girl pulled me out before the chair reached the bottom." Only then did Richard look directly at Annie. She was still slightly bent beside Margaret, one knee touching the floor, one hand supporting the older woman's back. Her blouse was wrinkled from the fall, and her breathing had not fully steadied. "I'm sorry, sir," Annie said at once. "I wasn't assigned to this hallway. I heard her calling, and You're apologizing?" Richard asked. Annie glanced at Margaret, then back at him. "I touched her without permission. I know there are rules here." Margaret let out a small sound of disbelief. "Rules?" Annie's voice remained cautious. "I just don't want anyone to say I handled a patient the wrong way." Richard looked from Annie to his mother, then back at the wheelchair. At the bottom of the slope, the right wheel was still bent at an odd angle, as if the chair itself had betrayed its only purpose. "My mother could have been seriously hurt," he said. Annie lowered her head. "Yes, sir. And you stopped that from happening. I tried to stop the chair first, but it wouldn't stop. So I pulled her out." Margaret gently tightened her grip on Annie's arm. She did not hesitate. Others did. Richard understood the meaning beneath his mother's words. A nurse arrived with a portable blood pressure monitor, followed by Grace Miller and 2 orderlies pushing a new wheelchair. Grace took charge immediately, without waiting to be asked. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to check you right here before anyone moves you," she said. Then she looked at Annie. "You stay right where you are too." "I'm fine," Annie said. Grace gave her the kind of look only a seasoned nurse could give. "I didn't ask if you were fine. I told you to stay where you are." Margaret smiled weakly. "Listen to her, Annie. She sounds like someone who has won many arguments like this before." "Many," Grace said. Richard stepped back just enough to give them room, but he did not leave. He watched as Grace checked Margaret's pupils, asked whether she felt dizzy, gently touched her shoulder and hip, and took her pulse. Margaret answered clearly, though her face still looked tired from the fear that had only just begun to fade. Another nurse turned to Annie. "Did you fall too?" "I lost my balance when I pulled her out." "Any sharp pain anywhere?" "No, ma'am, just sore." The nurse reached toward Annie's arm to examine it, and Annie almost pulled back by reflex. Grace immediately spoke to the nurse. "Slow down. Ask her before you touch her." The nurse stopped. "May I check your arm?" Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Richard asked, "What is your full name?" "Annie Carter." "Do you work here?" "I'm a rehabilitation support intern. Evening shift." "Who supervises you?" Annie hesitated. "Mostly Nurse Brooks, sometimes Nurse Miller." Grace did not look up from checking Margaret's pulse. "She's a good one." Annie looked embarrassed. "I'm still learning, ma'am." Margaret turned to Richard. She knew what to do when no one else did. "I didn't know exactly," Annie said. "I just saw that the chair wasn't stopping." "That is often the difference," Margaret said. "Some people only see, some people act." Richard stood still. He had heard many speeches in boardrooms about innovation, compassion, and patient safety, but none of them had ever sounded as honest as his mother's words now, spoken while she sat on a hospital floor beside the young intern who had just pulled her out of danger. After Grace gave permission, the 2 orderlies helped Margaret into the new wheelchair. Annie stood at the same time, but she rose too quickly and swayed, her shoulder brushing the wall. Richard stepped forward. "Careful. I'm Fina." "You keep saying that." "Because I am." Grace gave a small laugh. "That is what every stubborn patient says right before we take them to an exam room." "I'm not a patient." "When you fall on a hospital floor," Grace said, "you belong to us for at least 10 minutes. Margaret looked at Richard. "Make sure the girl is checked too." "I will," he said. Annie shook her head. "Mr. Whitmore, I really don't want to cause trouble. If Nurse Brooks finds out I left my assigned area, I will speak to anyone who needs to be spoken to. That frightened Annie more than it comforted her. Please don't make this bigger than it has to be, she said. I need this internship. Richard's expression changed. It did not exactly soften, but it sharpened with attention. You think saving my mother could cost you your internship? Annie did not answer right away. Grace answered for her. Sir, in hospitals, the person with the least power is often the first one questioned and the last one protected. If Annie's courage touched your heart, please give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And if you believe people who do the right thing deserve to be seen, subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about kindness, truth, and justice. Richard looked at Grace, then back at Annie. No one will punish you for this. Annie wanted to believe him. But trust had never come easily to people who had to count bus fare before buying lunch. Margaret reached out and took Annie's hand again. Thank you, Annie Carter. Annie's throat tightened. You're welcome, ma'am. No, Margaret said gently. Call me Margaret, if you can. Annie gave a small, uncertain smile. I'll try. Richard quietly watched the exchange. And something inside him shifted. His mother, who had spent the past 2 weeks refusing half the specialists he had hired, was now trusting a young woman she had only just met. Grace began pushing Margaret's wheelchair toward the examination room. Richard walked beside her. But after only 2 steps, Margaret looked back. Richard, yes, Mom? Don't take that call again. He looked down at the phone in his hand. It had started vibrating once more. This time, Richard turned it off. By the time Annie reached the small exam room beside the rehabilitation wing, Margaret was already seated near the bed with a warm blanket around her shoulders. Grace checked her blood pressure while another nurse entered notes into a tablet. Richard stood near the door with his phone turned off in his hand, as if he did not quite know what to do with a quiet device. Annie stopped just inside the doorway. She did not want to crowd the room. She had spent enough time in hospitals to know how invisible lines worked. Families stood near the bed. Doctors stood with charts. Nurses moved with purpose. Interns stayed where they were told. Grace glanced up. Don't hover in the doorway, Annie. Sit. I can stand. You can sit. Margaret patted the chair beside her. Please. You make me nervous standing there like you're waiting to be scolded. Annie gave a small smile and sat, though only on the edge of the chair. Her shoulders still ached, and her wrist felt stiff from gripping the wheelchair. But she kept her hands folded in her lap. The last thing she wanted was to become another problem. The nurse finished checking Margaret's pulse and said, No signs of immediate injury, but we'll keep you under observation tonight. Dr. Patel is on the way. Margaret nodded. Thank you, dear. The nurse turned to Annie. Your turn. I'm really all right. Grace crossed her arms. You keep saying that like it's going to become a medical report. Margaret chuckled softly, the sound thin but real. She has you there. Annie allowed the nurse to check her arm and shoulder. There was no serious injury, only soreness. A small scrape, and a bruise beginning near her elbow. The nurse cleaned the scrape, placed a bandage over it, and told her to rest the arm when possible. Annie almost laughed. Rest was a word people used when someone else could afford to be tired. Richard watched the nurse leave, then stepped forward. Miss Carter. Annie looked up quickly. Yes, sir? Richard is fine. She did not answer. Calling him Richard felt impossible. His name was on plaques, donor walls, press releases, and hospital emails. Men like him were not usually addressed by first name by girls in wrinkled scrubs. He seemed to understand. Mr. Whitmore, then, if that's easier. Yes, sir. I need to thank you properly. You don't have to. I was just passing by. Margaret gave her a look. Annie. Annie lowered her eyes. I mean, anyone would have helped. No, Margaret said. Several people did not. That landed in the room without being cruel. It was simply true. Richard's face tightened. I heard there were others in the hall. There were, Annie said. Careful now. But it happened fast. They had time to criticize you afterward, Margaret said. Annie wished Margaret had not said it with Richard in the room. Not because it was false, but because truth could become trouble when powerful people started looking for someone to blame. Richard turned slightly toward Grace. Who was there? Grace met his eyes. Visitors. 2 orderlies. A nurse came after. I'll write what I saw. And what Mrs. Whitmore told me. I want the wheelchair secured, Richard said. No one touches it until maintenance and risk management inspect it. Grace nodded. Already told the orderlies. I also told them if that chair disappears, I'll make more noise than they want at midnight. Margaret smiled. Grace has always had a gift for making men nervous. Only the ones who need it, Grace said. Annie looked between them, surprised by the warmth. Margaret knew Grace, not in the polite way wealthy patients knew nurses, but in the way people know someone who has seen them weak and still treated them with dignity. Richard noticed Annie's expression. Nurse Miller cared for my mother after her first surgery years ago. Before he bought half the city, Grace said. Richard gave her a tired look. I did not buy half the city. Fine, a quarter. Margaret laughed again, then pressed a hand lightly to her chest as if the laugh had surprised her. Richard moved closer at once. Mother? I'm all right, she said. It feels good to laugh after being scared. Annie watched him adjust the blanket around Margaret's knees. His hand was careful, almost awkward. For all his money and command, he looked uncertain doing simple things for his mother. That touched Annie more than she expected. She had seen rich families hire people for tenderness and then forget how to offer it themselves. Dr. Patel arrived a few minutes later, wearing a white coat over navy scrubs. He greeted Margaret with a gentle Mrs. Whitmore, asked a series of questions, checked her pupils, shoulders, ribs, and legs, then recommended observation overnight and a follow-up scan only if symptoms appeared. No headache, he asked. No. No dizziness? Only when I think about the bill for this room, Margaret said. Richard sighed. Mother, Dr. Patel smiled. We'll monitor you. I'm more concerned about why the wheelchair moved at all. So am I, Richard said. The doctor glanced at Annie. You were the one who assisted her? Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Fast thinking. Risky but fast. Annie waited for the criticism that usually followed. Dr. Patel continued. Given the slope and the chair speed, you may have prevented a major injury. Next time, shout for help if you can. I did shout, Annie said, then softened her tone. But I understand. I'm not blaming you, he said. I'm saying you shouldn't have had to handle that alone. That was the first sentence from a hospital authority that did not make Annie feel smaller. Richard looked at Annie again. Can I call someone for you? A parent? A ride home? Annie shook her head. No, sir. My mother's asleep, and I still have a shift. Grace made a sound under her breath. This child. I need the hours, Annie said. Richard heard more in that sentence than the words themselves. You were almost hurt helping my mother, and you're worried about hours? Annie's fingers tightened around the strap of her ID badge. Interns don't get a lot of chances. If we miss things, people remember. Margaret reached over and touched Annie's hand. Then let them remember this. Annie looked at the older woman. That's not always how it works. Margaret studied her for a moment. No, I suppose it isn't. The words were quiet, but they held understanding. Not full understanding, perhaps. Margaret had never had to count coins for bus fare, or worry that one supervisor's complaint could close a door forever. But she was old enough to know that life was not fair simply because people said it should be. Richard slipped his phone into his pocket. Your supervisor will be informed that you acted appropriately during an emergency. Annie's stomach tightened. Please don't make it sound like I caused a scene. You saved my mother. I know, but people can turn things around. Grace looked at Richard. She's telling you the truth. Richard paused. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his protection could feel like danger to someone without power. Then I'll be careful, he said, but I won't be silent. Margaret leaned back against the pillow Grace had placed behind her. The fear had drained from her face, leaving exhaustion behind. Annie, she said, before they send you away to finish folding towels or whatever terrible thing they make students do at midnight, come here. Annie stood and moved closer. Margaret took both her hands. Thank you for seeing me. Annie blinked. Seeing you? Not the chair, not the blanket, not an old woman in the way. Me. Annie felt a sting behind her eyes and looked down before anyone could notice. You were scared, she said. I know what that looks like. Margaret held her hands a moment longer, then let go. I thought you might. A call came through the desk phone outside the room. Grace stepped out to answer it, and Dr. Patel began giving instructions to the nurse. Richard moved beside his mother. but his eyes followed Annie as she picked up the folded towels from the chair where someone had placed them. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. Annie tucked the towels against her side. "Yes, sir, I do." It was not defiance. It was survival. As she left the exam room, she heard Margaret say softly behind her, "Richard, find out who that girl is." Annie kept walking, pretending she had not heard. But the sentence followed her down the hall, past the overturned wheelchair now guarded near the ramp, past the garden doors, and back toward the linen room where her night had begun. She still did not know that Margaret Whitmore's name could open doors across Chicago. She only knew that a frightened woman had asked for help, and for once, someone had thanked her for answering. Annie did not get back to the linen room as quickly as she hoped. By the time she reached the supply someone had already pushed it against the wall, and the towels she had dropped earlier were folded again, though not as neatly as she would have done them. A sticky note sat on top in blue ink. "See Nurse Brooks before you leave." Her stomach sank. She stared at the note for a few seconds, then slipped it into her pocket. Around her, the hospital had returned to its usual midnight rhythm. Monitors beeped behind closed doors. A floor machine hummed somewhere near the elevators. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air with the faint bitterness of old coffee. Nothing about the hallway looked like a place where someone had nearly been hurt. That was what bothered Annie most. The ramp was still there. The shine on the floor was still there. The garden doors still reflected the lights. If she had not seen the wheelchair lying on its side, guarded now by an orderly who looked annoyed to be standing there, she might have wondered whether the whole thing had happened in her head. She finished sorting the towels because unfinished work followed people like her. A rich man could leave a meeting and call it an emergency. An intern left a cart half-stocked, and someone wrote it down. At the nurse's station, two women stopped talking when Annie walked up. One looked at her badge, then at her face, as if comparing her to a story she had just heard. "Nurse Brooks asked for me," Annie said. "She's in Motherℹ," one of them replied. Annie thanked her and walked down the short hall. Helen Brooks stood at the counter inside the small medication preparation room, checking labels under the bright light. Her posture was straight, her gray blonde hair pulled tight, her expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me?" Annie asked from the doorway. Helen did not turn at once. "Close the door." Annie stepped inside and closed it halfway. "All the way." She obeyed. Helen placed a medication cup into a tray before looking at her. "I heard there was an incident near the garden ramp." "Yes, ma'am." "With Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes, ma'am." Helen's mouth tightened slightly at the name. "Do you understand what kind of patient Mrs. Whitmore is?" Annie knew the answer was not medical. "She's in the VIP wing. She is the mother of Richard Whitmore. He sits on boards that affect funding for this hospital. He knows donors, administrators, legal teams. When something happens to a patient like that, every detail matters." Annie kept her hands at her sides. The wheelchair was rolling. She called for help. "I'm not asking what she did. I'm asking what you did." "I ran after the chair and pulled her out of it." "Yes." Helen breathed through her nose. "Annie, you are an intern. You are here to observe, assist, and learn under supervision. You are not trained to make emergency transfer decisions on a moving patient. There wasn't time to find someone. You should have called out." "I did. You should have hit the emergency button. There wasn't one near me. You should have braced the chair." "I tried." Annie's voice stayed even, but something in her chest began to rise. The brake didn't hold, and the chair kept sliding. Helen folded her arms. "You were lucky she wasn't injured." Annie looked at her. "She was lucky I was there." The words came out before she could soften them. Helen's eyebrows lifted. Annie swallowed, but she did not take it back. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the refrigerator clicking on behind them. Helen looked at her as if deciding whether this was disrespect or exhaustion. "You need to be careful," Helen said. "People are going to ask questions. Risk management, administration, maybe legal. They will want to know why a student was involved. Because no one else moved." Helen's face cooled. "That is not how you speak in an official review. It's what happened." "What happened," Helen said, "is that a vulnerable patient was involved in a safety event, and you inserted yourself into it." Annie stared at her. "Inserted myself? You know what I mean." "No, ma'am, I don't think I do." Helen picked up the tray and set it aside, more sharply than needed. "Do not let one dramatic moment make you forget your position here." There it was, not shouted, Not ugly enough for anyone to file a complaint. Just clean, polished, and heavy. Annie felt her face grow warm. She thought of Margaret's hand gripping her sleeve, of the man with the phone explaining what she should have done, of the empty chair at the bottom of the ramp. My position was close enough to help, Annie said. That's all. Helen opened her mouth, but a knock came at the door. Grace Miller pushed it open without waiting. Am I interrupting? Grace asked, in a tone that said she knew exactly what she was interrupting. Helen straightened. I'm speaking with Annie about procedure. Good. Procedure matters. So does judgment. Grace looked at Annie. Dr. Patel wants her to clock out after observation clears her. She's not finishing the shift. Annie turned. I can finish. No, you can't, Grace said. You had enough excitement for one night. Helen's lips pressed together. Her assigned duties still need to be completed. I'll finish them, Grace said. You're a charge nurse, not housekeeping. And yet my hands work fine. Grace's gaze did not move. Annie needs to document what happened while it's fresh. Then she goes home. Helen looked from Grace to Annie. Fine, but I want a written statement before she leaves. She'll write one, Grace said, and it will say the chair moved because the brake failed. We don't know that yet. Grace smiled without warmth. Mrs. Whitmore said it. Annie said it. The chair is lying at the bottom of the ramp like it has a confession to make. But yes, let maintenance take a look. Annie almost smiled, but stopped herself. Helen dismissed her with a small nod. Go write your statement. Annie left the med prep room with Grace beside her. They walked in silence until they reached the quieter hallway near the staff break room. Grace stopped. You all right? Annie nodded too quickly. Try again. Annie leaned against the wall and let out a breath. I don't want to lose this internship. You won't lose it tonight. That doesn't mean I won't lose it later. Grace studied her for a second, then softened. You've been carrying that fear longer than tonight, haven't you? Annie looked away. Grace did not press. Come on, I'll get you coffee. I don't drink coffee this late. Then you can hold it and pretend. Half the staff runs on pretending. In the break room, Grace poured coffee into a paper cup and set it in front of Annie anyway. The room smelled like burnt grounds and microwave soup. A television mounted in the corner played a late-night weather report with the sound turned low. Snow was expected again before morning. Annie sat at the small table and began writing her statement. She kept it plain. Time. Location. Patient calling for help. Wheelchair. Moving down the ramp. Attempt to stop chair. Brake not holding. Assisted patient out of chair to prevent impact. Patient remained conscious and speaking. Grace read it over her shoulder. Good. Don't apologize in the statement. I didn't. You almost did with your face. Annie looked up. Can they really punish me? They can try to make you feel like the problem. Grace pulled out the chair across from her and sat. That's not the same as proving you were. Annie rubbed her thumb against the edge of the paper cup. Mrs. Whitmore said thank you like she meant it. She did mean it. That doesn't always help. No, Grace said, but it matters who heard it. Annie thought of Richard Whitmore standing by the exam room door, watching everything too closely. He heard. Yes, he did. I don't know if that's good. Grace gave a low chuckle. Smart girl. Annie looked at her. Powerful people can be helpful, Grace said. They can also make a mess while thinking they're helping. But tonight, that man looked like someone who just realized money didn't keep his mother safe. Annie considered that. He turned off his phone. Grace nodded. That may not sound like much. For a man like him, it's nearly a medical event. This time Annie did smile. Grace stood and patted the table. Finish up. I'll turn this in with mine. Annie hesitated. Thank you. For what? For coming into that room. Grace's face softened. Baby. I've seen too many young women stand alone in rooms where everyone else had a title. I try not to let it happen when I can help it. Annie looked down at the written statement. Her handwriting was neat, though her hand felt tired. After Grace left, Annie sat a little longer, listening to the vending machine hum and the weather report whisper about freezing roads. She thought about calling her mother, then decided against waking her. Denise had to be at work by 6. There would be time to explain later, though Annie already knew she would leave out the worst parts. Near 1 in the morning, Grace walked Annie to the staff exit. The hallway near the ramp had been marked with a yellow caution sign. The wheelchair was gone, taken for inspection, but one faint black mark remained near the rubber stopper where it had struck. Annie paused when she saw it. Grace noticed. "You did good tonight." Annie nodded, but her eyes stayed on the mark. "It's strange. If I came through 5 minutes later, I never would have known. That's how danger works in hospitals," Grace said. Quiet until it isn't. Outside the staff entrance, Chicago air hit Annie's face like cold water. The bus stop stood half a block away under a street lamp. She tightened her coat around her scrubs and started walking. Behind her, Street Catherine Medical Center rose bright and expensive against the winter sky. Somewhere inside, Margaret Whitmore was being watched for the night. Somewhere else, Richard Whitmore was probably asking questions people were not ready to answer. Annie only knew she was tired, sore, and due back sooner than she wanted to think about. At the bus stop, she sat beneath the shelter and finally let her hands shake. Not because she regretted running, because she understood, with a heaviness she could not name, that doing the right thing had not ended when the wheelchair stopped. It had only begun. The bus came 12 minutes late, hissing to the curb with its headlights cutting through the thin snow. Annie climbed on, tapped her pass, and took a seat near the back where the heater rattled under the window. Only 5 other passengers rode with her. A man asleep with his chin on his chest. A woman in grocery store shoes holding a plastic bag on her lap. 2 teenagers sharing earbuds, and an older man in a work jacket staring out at the dark streets. Chicago moved past in pieces. Closed storefronts. Salt-streaked sidewalks. A gas station glowing under white lights. Annie leaned her head against the cold window and watched her reflection tremble with every bump in the road. Her phone buzzed once. "Mom, you off yet?" Annie stared at the message, then typed, "On the bus. I'm okay." The reply came almost at once. "Mom, you don't text, 'I'm okay,' unless something happened." Annie almost smiled. Denise Carter could read worry through a screen. She typed, "Long night. Tell you at home." Then she put the phone face down on her lap and closed her eyes. The scene at the ramp kept coming back in small bursts. Margaret's hands in the air, the wheels clicking, the strangers standing back, the way Richard Whitmore had turned off his phone like a man putting down a weapon he had carried too long. By the time Annie reached Southside, the snow had thickened into a fine powder. Her apartment building sat between a small church and a corner store with metal bars across the windows. The lobby smelled faintly of old radiator heat and someone's fried onions. She climbed the stairs quietly, but the kitchen light was already on when she opened the door. Denise stood by the stove in her robe, a scarf tied around her hair, stirring a small pot of soup like she had been awake for hours. "You said long night," Denise said. "That means sit down. Mom, you have work in the morning, and you have a face that says you scared me in advance." Denise pointed the spoon toward the chair. "Sit." Annie obeyed. The apartment was small, but it had the kind of order Denise insisted on no matter how tired she was. Mail stacked by date, shoes lined by the door, a Bible and a jar of loose coins on the windowsill. A photo of Annie's father in his old delivery uniform stood near the microwave, his smile caught forever in a better year. Denise set a bowl of chicken noodle soup in front of Annie. "Eat first." "I'm not that hungry." "Eat anyway. Bad news lands softer on something warm." Annie took a spoonful to avoid arguing. The soup tasted like bouillon, celery, and home. Denise sat across from her. "Now talk." Annie told her most of it. The woman in the wheelchair, the broken brakes, the ramp, pulling her out before the chair hit the wall. She left out the part where her hands shook afterward and softened the part where people criticized her. Mothers did not need every sharp edge handed to them at 1 in the morning. Denise listened without interrupting, but her mouth tightened. "You fell? Not bad, just sore. Let me see. Mum, let me see." Annie rolled her sleeve enough to show the bandage near her elbow. Denise took her arm gently, turning it under the kitchen light. Her fingers were rough from laundry work, but careful. "They checked you?" "Yes." Nurse Miller made sure. "Good woman?" "The best." Denise released her arm. "And the lady? She's all right?" "She seemed okay. They were watching her overnight." Denise nodded, then leaned back. "You did right." Annie looked down at the soup. Nurse Brooks didn't exactly think so. What did she say? That I'm an intern. That I overstepped. That I got lucky. Denise's eyes narrowed. People love calling courage luck when it didn't come from them. Annie stirred the soup but did not eat. Some visitors said I should have stopped the chair instead of pulling her out. Did they stop it? No. Then they can season their opinions and eat them. Despite herself, Annie laughed. Denise's face softened, but only for a second. Baby, listen to me. You are going to meet people who would rather watch you fail than admit you did something they were too scared to do. Some of them will have badges, some will have degrees, some will smile while they do it. Don't let their comfort rewrite what happened. Annie swallowed. It was Richard Whitmore's mother. Denise went still. The hospital Whitmore? I didn't know, not until after. Denise sat back slowly. Lord, that's why I'm worried. About what? Everything. If they make it big, Nurse Brooks could say I caused trouble. If they keep it quiet, someone could still blame me later. And if Mr. Whitmore gets involved, I don't know what that means. Denise looked toward the photo of Annie's father, then back at her daughter. When your daddy was alive, he used to say, rich people don't open doors by accident. They open them when they want something, or when something scared them bad enough to remember they're human. Annie gave a tired smile. That sounds like Dad. It was one of his better lines. Denise reached across the table and touched Annie's hand. But the woman you saved? What did she say? She thanked me. She asked my name. Did she look at you like she meant it? Annie thought of Margaret repeating her name slowly. Yes. Then hold on to that tonight. Not the nurse. Not the strangers. Her. Annie nodded, though worry still sat heavy in her chest. The next morning came too soon. Annie woke to her alarm at 6:30 with her shoulders stiff and her mind already running. Denise had left for work, but a note waited beside a wrapped biscuit on the counter. Proud of you. Don't shrink. Annie folded the note and put it in the pocket of her coat. At Street Catherine, the story had traveled faster than she had. She felt it the moment she walked through the employee entrance. A transporter looked at her, then whispered to another man. 2 nursing students stopped talking as she passed. At the time clock, someone had taped a new notice about incident reporting procedures to the wall. Annie clocked in and headed for the rehabilitation wing. Nurse Brooks was at the desk, reading a chart. She did not look up right away. You're late, Helen said. Annie checked the clock. 2 minutes early. For your shift, not for the staff briefing. I wasn't told there was one. Helen closed the chart. There is now. 3 nurses and 2 interns gathered near the desk. Helen spoke about safety, patient handling, scope of practice, and the importance of following chain of command. She never said Annie's name, which somehow made it worse. When emotions take over, Helen said, patients can be placed at greater risk, even by people with good intentions. Annie kept her eyes on the floor. One of the interns beside her, a red-haired girl named Megan, leaned close and whispered, Is she talking about you? Annie whispered back. Apparently. Helen's gaze moved toward them. Something to add? Annie lifted her head. Her mother's note seemed to burn in her coat pocket. No, Mom. Helen dismissed the group. Annie turned toward the linen cart, but Grace appeared at the end of the hall carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Carter, Grace called. Come with me. Helen frowned. She has assignments. And now she has another one. Grace handed Annie a cup she had not asked for. Mrs. Whitmore requested her. Annie nearly dropped the coffee. She did? Grace nodded. By name. Helen's expression tightened. That request should go through proper channels. It did, Grace said. Dr. Patel approved a short visit. Mr. Whitmore did not object. That last sentence changed the air around the desk. Annie followed Grace toward the elevator, her heart beating too fast. Am I in trouble? Grace pressed the button. Not with Mrs. Whitmore. That's not what I asked. I know. Grace glanced at her. Keep your shoulders back when you walk in. Gratitude makes some people uncomfortable. Let it. The elevator opened on the VIP floor, where the carpets softened their steps and the walls held framed photographs of hospital donors. Annie had cleaned rooms up here before, but she had never been invited. At Margaret's door, Grace knocked once and opened it. Margaret sat by the window with a cup of tea in both hands. Richard stood near the far wall, speaking quietly with Dr. Patel. He stopped when Annie entered. Margaret's face brightened. There she is, she said. Annie Carter. Annie stepped inside, suddenly aware of her shoes, her uniform, and every person in the room. Good morning, ma'am. Margaret held out one hand. Come here, child. I wanted to see the person everyone keeps talking about before they forget to ask how she is. Annie crossed the room. Richard watched her with an expression she could not read. Then he said, Miss Carter, I owe you more than a thank you. Annie felt the floor beneath her seem less steady than the ramp had been. Margaret took her hand before she could answer. First, the old woman said, she gets to sit down. Margaret did not let go of Annie's hand until Annie sat in the chair beside the window. It was a soft chair, too soft for someone used to sitting on bus seats, break room stools, and the edge of exam tables. Annie sat carefully, as if the fabric might object to her being there. Richard noticed. So did Margaret. Relax your shoulders, Margaret said. You look like someone told you the chair belongs to the mayor. Annie gave a small laugh before she could stop herself. I'm not used to sitting in patient rooms unless I'm charting something. Then today you can sit as my guest. Dr. Patel closed his folder. Mrs. Whitmore is stable. No signs of delayed injury. But I still want observation through the afternoon. No more garden trips until maintenance clears the equipment. Margaret lifted her eyebrows. I suppose I have been grounded. For your own good, Dr. Patel said. People always say that when they are taking away your freedom. Richard looked at his mother. You scared me enough for 1 week. I scared myself too, she said, then turned back to Annie. But this young woman scared the fear right out of me. Annie looked down. I just did what anyone should have done. Richard moved closer, but he kept enough distance not to crowd her. That is exactly what concerns me. Several people had the chance to do what anyone should have done. You were the one who did it. Annie did not know how to answer that. Praise made her more uncomfortable than criticism. Criticism, at least, was familiar. She could brace for it. Margaret studied her. Did you sleep? A little. That means no. I had to get up for my shift. Richard frowned. You came back to work this morning? Yes, sir. After last night? Annie looked at him, unsure whether it was a real question. I was scheduled. Margaret sighed. Richard, you hear that? Scheduled. The word that makes tired people pretend they are not tired. Annie tried to smile. I'm all right. Grace, still standing near the door, made a sound. That child has said I'm all right so many times I'm about to write it on her chart as a symptom. Margaret pointed gently toward Annie's bandaged arm. Does it hurt? Not much. Annie. A little, Annie admitted. Richard looked toward Dr. Patel. Should she be working today? Dr. Patel's eyes moved to Annie. Medically, she should avoid lifting, pushing, or transferring patients for at least a day, light duty only. Annie straightened. I can work. I don't want to lose hours. Richard heard the edge of worry in her voice. You won't lose them. Annie almost answered too quickly, but stopped. People with money said things like that easily. They did not always understand that schedules, evaluations, and quiet punishments lived in small places where their promises did not reach. Margaret saw the hesitation. You don't believe him? Annie flushed. It's not that. It is exactly that, Margaret said, not offended. And you may be right to be careful. Richard looked at his mother. She looked back at him. Don't look wounded, Richard. You have spent your life in rooms where your name opens doors. She has spent hers making sure nobody closes one on her fingers. The words settled over him. Annie looked away, embarrassed by the truth of it. Richard spoke more carefully this time. Miss Carter, I cannot undo how people in this building have made you feel. But I can make sure last night is documented correctly. I already asked risk management to preserve the chair and pull hallway footage. Annie's stomach tightened. Footage? Yes. What if it looks bad? Richard's brow furrowed. Bad? I mean, I pulled her out. If someone watches without hearing what happened, they might say I was rough, or I panicked. Grace crossed her arms. And that is why statements matter. Margaret squeezed Annie's hand again. I will give mine. So will I, Richard said. Annie glanced at him. You didn't see it happen. No, he said, and this time there was no defense in his voice. I didn't. Margaret looked at him with the tenderness that only made guilt harder to bear. You came back. After I had walked away. For a phone call, not a vacation. That doesn't make it better. No, she said, but it makes it human. Annie listened quietly. Until that moment, Richard Whitmore had seemed like a man carved out of decisions and money, but standing beside his mother's hospital chair, He looked like any son who had almost learned too late that one ordinary minute could split a life in half. A knock came at the door. Helen Brooks stepped in with a tablet tucked against her side. Her eyes moved to Annie in the chair, then to Margaret's hand resting over Annie's. "Mrs. Whitmore," Helen said, professional and polished. "I'm glad to see you're doing well." "Thank you," Margaret replied. "Annie helped make that possible." Helen's mouth held its shape. "Yes. We're reviewing the incident." Richard turned toward her. "Good. Then you can confirm Miss Carter is on light duty today, and that nothing negative related to this emergency goes into her evaluation." Helen blinked once. "Mr. Whitmore, evaluations are handled through the training program, and safety failures are handled through administration, legal, maintenance, and anyone else I decide needs to be in the room." His tone stayed calm. "I am not asking you to praise her if you don't believe she earned it. I am telling you not to punish her for acting when the equipment failed." Helen shifted the tablet in her arms. "No one is punishing her." Annie kept her eyes on her hands. Grace gave a dry little hum that said more than a sentence would have. Margaret looked at Helen. "Miss Brooks, is it?" "Nurse Brooks." "Nurse Brooks," Margaret said. "Last night, when I was rolling down that ramp, I did not need a committee. I needed someone with a pair of legs and a conscience." Annie had both. Helen's cheeks colored slightly. "I understand, Mrs. Whitmore." "I hope so," Richard added. "I want the maintenance records for every wheelchair used in the rehabilitation and VIP wings for the past 6 months." Helen looked uncomfortable. "That request would go through facilities. Then facilities should receive it before lunch. I'll inform the unit manager." "Thank you." Helen turned to Annie. "Carter, when you're done here, report to the desk. We'll adjust your tasks." Annie stood at once. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret did not let her hand go. "She is done when I am done thanking her." The corner of Grace's mouth lifted. Helen paused. "Of course." When the door closed behind Helen, Annie let out a breath she did not mean for anyone to hear. Richard heard it. "She makes you nervous." Annie did not want to lie, but truth had to be handled carefully. "She's my supervisor." "That wasn't my question." Grace stepped in before Annie had to choose between honesty and safety. "Power makes people nervous when it can write reports about them." Margaret nodded. "Then perhaps power should learn manners." Annie finally smiled. Richard pulled the visitor chair closer but did not sit until Margaret nodded toward it, an old habit between mother and son. "Miss Carter, do you have class today?" "After my shift." "What are you studying?" "Nursing prerequisites. Anatomy right now. Pharmacology next term if I can keep up." "If?" Annie wished she had not said it. "It's just a lot." Margaret heard what Richard did not. "A lot of work or a lot of money?" Annie looked at the floor. Richard leaned back slightly, as if not wanting to press too hard. "You don't have to answer," Margaret said. "She doesn't. But you should understand that people do not come to work sore after a night like last night unless they cannot afford to rest." Annie's throat tightened. "My mom says rest is expensive." Grace nodded once. "Your mother sounds right." Richard's expression changed again. Not pity, not exactly. Attention, the kind that made Annie more nervous than his authority. Margaret lifted her teacup, then stopped as her hand trembled. Annie reached for the cup without thinking, and steadied it. "Sorry," Annie said. Margaret smiled. "There you go, apologizing for helping again." Annie let out a quiet laugh. "Bad habit. Then we will cure it." For a few minutes, the room felt less like a hospital room and more like a kitchen table where older women made decisions younger people were not invited to escape. Margaret asked Annie about her mother, her commute, her classes. Annie answered cautiously at first, then a little more fully. She told them she lived on the south side, took the bus, and wanted to work in patient care because she knew what it felt like when families were scared and nobody explained anything. Richard listened without interrupting. When Annie stood to leave, Margaret said, "Will you come see me tomorrow?" Annie looked toward Grace, then toward the door, as if permission might be hiding there. Grace said, "If it's approved and doesn't interfere with rotation, she can." Richard said, "I'll see that it's approved." Annie nodded. "Then yes, ma'am." "Margaret," the old woman reminded her. Annie tried. "Yes, Margaret." The name felt strange in her mouth, but Margaret looked pleased. As Annie stepped into the hallway, she saw Helen at the nurse's station speaking quietly with the unit manager. Both glanced at her, then looked away. The old fear returned, but something else came with it now. Margaret's hand. Grace's voice. Richard asking for records. For the first time since the wheelchair stopped, Annie wondered if maybe the truth would not have to stand alone. Behind her, inside the room, Richard looked through the glass panel at the young woman walking back toward the staff elevator. Margaret followed his gaze. Do not turn her into a headline, Richard. I wasn't planning to. You were thinking like a businessman. He looked at his mother. What should I think like? She leaned back, tired but clear-eyed, like a son whose mother is alive because a girl with no reason to help did anyway. Richard said nothing. Margaret closed her eyes. Start there. Richard stayed in his mother's room after Annie left, but his attention had moved into the hallway with her. Through the glass panel, he watched her stop at the nurse's station, accept a stack of charts from Helen Brooks, and nod as if every instruction deserved respect, even when the person giving it had offered little in return. Margaret opened one eye. You're staring. I'm observing. You used to observe cookies the same way when you were 6, right before you stole them. He turned back to her. You're supposed to be resting. And you're supposed to be thinking like a son. Are you? Richard slipped his hands into his pockets. I'm trying. Good. Then try with your heart first and your lawyers second. That drew a short breath from him, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in his face. The lawyers will have to be involved. A wheelchair brake failed while you were sitting in it. I'm not telling you to ignore that. I'm telling you not to let the lawyers make the girl feel like a problem. She won't be treated like one. Margaret looked at him. Richard, he knew that tone. It was the same voice she had used when he was 16 and tried to explain why a broken window was not technically his fault. I said she won't be treated like one, he repeated softer, but I need to know how that chair was still in use. Then ask, don't thunder. I don't thunder. You absolutely thunder. Quietly, but you do. He looked toward the door again. She came back to work this morning. Because she needs the job. She said she needs the hours. Same thing. In a poor girl's language. Richard did not answer. He had spent years donating to scholarship funds, hospital outreach programs, neighborhood clinics, workforce training, all the proper structures that looked good in annual reports. Yet Annie Carter had stood in his mother's room afraid that saving a life might cost her a shift. That fact sat in him like something sharp. Dr. Patel returned with final notes and confirmed that Margaret would remain under observation until late afternoon. Richard listened, asked the right questions, and thanked him. Once the doctor left, Richard called his assistant from the hallway. Cancel my morning meetings. There was a pause on the other end. All of them? His assistant asked. Yes. The Zurich call? Move it. The board lunch? Send Ethan. And the governor's office? Richard looked through the glass at his mother, who had closed her eyes but was not sleeping. They can wait. Another pause. His assistant had worked for him long enough to know when not to argue. Understood. Is Mrs. Whitmore all right? She is. I need you to pull something for me. Annie Carter, rehab support intern at Street Catherine. I want her training file, supervisor notes, schedule, and any financial aid information legally available through the scholarship office. Quietly. Is this related to the incident? Yes, and I mean quietly. No calls to her home. No one bothering her. Understood. And get me the maintenance records for mobility equipment in rehab and VIP. 6 months minimum. If anyone says that takes time, tell them I'm already waiting. This time his assistant did not pause. I'll start now. Richard ended the call and stood there with the phone in his hand, not turning it off this time, but not looking at it either. Down the hall, Annie moved from room to room with a linen cart. Light duty, apparently, had become everyone's favorite excuse to hand her small tasks. She replaced towels, refilled water cups, checked supply drawers, and smiled at patients who did not know her name. Once, an older man in a room near the elevators asked her to adjust his blinds. She did it carefully, and when he complained that she had left them too low, she fixed them again without a word. Richard watched longer than he meant to. Grace appeared beside him with a chart tucked under one arm. You planning to follow her all morning, or should I bring you a visitor badge that says suspicious billionaire? He looked at her. Does everyone in this hospital speak to me that way? No. Most people are scared of you. I'm old enough to be selective. She always that quiet? Richard asked. Annie? She's quiet until somebody is in trouble. Then she moves. That sounds like experience. Grace looked down the hall, where Annie was helping a patient's wife find the family restroom. It is. Girls like her learn early. Watch the room. Read the mood. Know who might need help before they ask. It's a survival skill people mistake for sweetness. Richard absorbed that. Helen Brooks thinks she overstepped. Helen Brooks thinks a lot of things. You don't like her. I respect her work. I don't always respect how she treats people without titles. That was not the kind of answer most employees gave him. It was useful because it was honest. Should Annie be in this program? He asked. Grace turned to him fully. If you mean does she belong in nursing? Yes. More than some people already wearing the badge. And if I mean can she survive the program? That depends. On what? Whether the program learns the difference between discipline and discouragement. Richard looked back toward Annie. My assistant is pulling her file. Grace's expression sharpened. For what purpose? To understand her situation. That can mean several things when said by a man with your address book. I'm not trying to expose her. Good. Because poor folks don't need rich people discovering them like abandoned property. The words hit, but Richard did not flinch. Fair. Grace studied him for a moment. You really don't know what to do with her, do you? I know she saved my mother. That's not the same as knowing what she needs. What does she need? Grace gave him the look again. The one that made executives feel like schoolboys. Ask her. And when she answers small, listen for what she's protecting. Before Richard could respond, his assistant texted him a secure file. He opened it in the small family consultation room near Margaret's suite, away from the nurse's station. The file was thin but enough. Annie Carter. High marks. Strong patient interaction. Excellent attendance. Commute. Bus. Dependent. Emergency contact. Denise Carter. Mother. Scholarship status. Partial. Balance due before next term. Enough to stop a young woman's future. Not enough to be noticed in a boardroom. Supervisor comments were mostly positive until the latest note from Helen Brooks, entered early that morning, requires reinforcement regarding scope, emotional decision-making, and boundaries with high-profile patients. Richard read that line twice. High-profile patients. As if his mother's life had been a category. As if Annie had not run toward danger, but toward status. He opened the maintenance file next. It was worse. 2 wheelchairs in the rehab wing had been flagged for weak brake resistance 3 weeks earlier. One had been removed. The second had been marked, monitor for replacement. A note from facilities said new parts were pending. Another note said equipment remained usable with caution. The chair identification number matched the one from the hallway ramp. Usable with caution. Richard leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for 1 second. There it was. Not malice. Not sabotage. Something colder in its own way. Delay. Budget caution. Paperwork language. A chain of small shrugs that ended with his mother rolling down a ramp. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan, his chief operating officer. Richard, I heard there was an issue at Street Catherine. Do you need me to handle the internal review? No. You sure? We should get ahead of liability. Richard's voice dropped. My mother was nearly injured in a chair. Our own records flagged weeks ago. And an intern had to pull her out of it. Ethan went quiet. I didn't know the chair had been flagged. You know now. We can contain this. That's not the first word I want to hear. I mean from a legal standpoint. I know what you mean. Ethan tried again. What do you want done? I want the chair records preserved. I want every similar device inspected by the end of the day. I want no one pressuring the intern, formally or informally. And I want the phrase usable with caution removed from the vocabulary of anyone responsible for moving human beings. Understood. Richard ended the call before Ethan could add anything polished. When he returned to Margaret's room, Annie was there again, placing a fresh water cup on the bedside table. She seemed surprised to see him and stepped back at once. I was just dropping this off. Margaret smiled. She says that every time she does something kind, Annie's cheeks warmed. I should get back. Miss Carter, Richard said. She stopped near the door. Yes, sir? I looked at the preliminary maintenance record. The chair had a documented brake issue. Annie blinked. It did? Yes. So I didn't imagine it. No, you didn't. Her shoulders lowered a fraction, so small most people would have missed it. Richard did not. Margaret saw it too. That matters, doesn't it? Annie nodded before she could hide it. Yes, ma'am, it does. Richard took a step closer, keeping his voice measured. I'm sorry you had to defend yourself before anyone checked the equipment. Annie looked unsure what to do with an apology from him. Thank you. I also saw a note in your file from this morning. I'm having it reviewed. The relief vanished from her face. My file? Richard realized his mistake the moment he said it. Grace's warning returned. Ask her. When she answers small, listen. I should have told you before looking, he said. I had your training record pulled because I wanted to make sure no one was penalizing you. I didn't think how that might feel. Annie's hand tightened around the edge of the door. People look at files and decide things. Yes, Richard said. They do. I don't want special trouble because I helped your mother. Margaret spoke gently. Special trouble is a very sad phrase, Annie. Annie gave a faint smile, but her eyes stayed guarded. Richard said, Then let me be clear. You are not in trouble. The equipment failed. The system failed. You did not. For once, Annie did not answer right away. She looked past him to Margaret, as if checking whether the old woman believed it too. Margaret nodded. You ran when others made excuses. That is the part I will remember. Annie's throat moved. Some of them said they were busy. Richard's expression hardened. Busy. One had a call. One said she was going to find help. One said he wasn't trained. Margaret looked at her son. Do you hear that, Richard? Everyone had a reason. Annie had a choice. Annie lowered her eyes. I should go. This time Richard did not stop her. After she left, Margaret looked at him for a long moment. You want to help her, she said. I want to make sure she's treated fairly. That is a beginning. What else? Margaret reached for her tea. Her hand was steadier now. Find out what door is closing on her. Then decide whether you are brave enough to open it without making her feel small. Richard looked through the doorway where Annie had disappeared. For a man who had bought companies, built hospitals, and negotiated with governors, it was strange to realize he had no idea how to help one young woman without turning her into a project. But he knew one thing for certain now. The wheelchair had not failed in a vacuum. It had rolled because people had looked away, delayed repairs, trusted paperwork, and stayed busy. Annie Carter had been the only person in that hallway who refused to let busy become an excuse. And Richard Whitmore, for the first time in years, wondered how many other people his hospitals had failed while everyone important was on the phone. Annie tried to keep the rest of her shift ordinary, but ordinary had become harder to find. Every hallway seemed to hold someone who had heard part of the story. A cafeteria worker gave her a thumbs up near the service elevator. A physical therapist asked if she was the wheelchair girl, then apologized when he saw her face. One patient's daughter thanked her for being brave. Another staff member looked her up and down and said nothing at all. By noon, Annie had learned that attention could feel almost as heavy as blame. She kept moving. She stocked gloves in the rehab rooms, refilled water pitchers, wiped down a therapy table, and carried paperwork from one desk to another. Because light duty did not mean no duty. Helen Brooks stayed professional, but every instruction came clipped at the edges. Room 412 needs fresh towels. Yes, ma'am. Do not lift anything heavier than the supply tray. Yes, ma'am. And Carter? Annie stopped. If anyone asks you about last night, direct them to administration. Do not give your personal version to staff or visitors. Annie held the towel stack against her chest. My personal version? Helen looked up from the chart. You know what I mean. I know what happened, and administration will determine how it is recorded. For a second, Annie saw again the man in the brown coat, lowering his phone only after she challenged him. She saw Margaret on the floor saying, "Stronger this time. She saved me." That is what happened. Annie nodded because arguing at the desk would not help. Yes, ma'am. She walked away before her face could say what her mouth did not. Near the elevators, Grace caught up with her. Don't let Helen rent space in your head. She said not to give my personal version. Grace snorted. Hospitals love that phrase. Personal version makes the truth sound like a hobby. Annie almost smiled. She said administration will determine how it's recorded. Administration can determine font size. They don't get to determine your memory. That helped more than Annie wanted to admit. Grace took the towels from her arms and shifted them to the cart. Mrs. Whitmore asked if you could stop by before your break. I don't want Nurse Brooks thinking I'm ignoring work. I cleared it with Dr. Patel. 10 minutes. Besides, Margaret has been asking for tea like she's hosting Sunday company. Is Mr. Whitmore there? Not at the moment. He's making people in suits regret coming to work. Annie followed Grace to the VIP floor. The ride up felt different now. Yesterday, the soft carpet and framed donor photographs had made Annie feel out of place. Today, she still felt out of place, but there was a small, stubborn part of her that remembered she had earned the right to walk through those doors. Margaret's room smelled faintly of tea and lemon. She sat by the window in a robe the color of pale blue morning, a tray across her lap. 2 cups sat on it, along with a small plate of shortbread cookies. "There you are," Margaret said. "I was afraid they had hidden you in a closet." Annie stepped inside. "No, ma'am. Just towels and water pitchers. Useful things. Sit." Annie glanced at Grace. Grace lifted both hands. "Don't look at me." She outranks everyone when she uses that voice. Annie sat in the chair beside Margaret. This time, she did not perch quite as close to the edge. Margaret noticed and smiled. Progress. Grace poured tea into the second cup and handed it to Annie. "Careful, it's hot." Annie accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." Margaret watched her for a moment. "When I was teaching 3rd grade, I kept a kettle in my classroom even though the principal said it was against policy." Annie looked up. "You were a teacher?" 41 years. Public school. Mostly children who came in hungry, angry, or tired, and sometimes all 3. Tea was not for them, of course, but the kettle made the room feel less like a place where people were always being corrected. Annie turned the cup slowly in her hands. "I would have liked your classroom. You still might have been told to stop running in the hall. I didn't run much in school. No, I tried not to get noticed." Margaret's expression softened. "That is a hard way for a child to live." Annie looked into the tea. It was easier. Easier than what? Being noticed for the wrong reasons. Margaret did not rush to answer. She broke a cookie in half and placed one piece on Annie's saucer, as if feeding a guest in her own kitchen. "When I first started teaching, I had a little boy named Calvin. He never raised his hand. Never. Knew every answer, but he would rather swallow it than speak. One day I asked him why, and he said, 'Because when I'm wrong, everybody looks.'" Annie gave a faint nod. "I understand, Calvin. I thought you might." They sat in a quiet that did not demand anything. Outside the window, traffic moved beyond the hospital grounds, slow and gray under the winter sky. Margaret sipped her tea. "Tell me about your mother." Annie hesitated. "She works too much. Most good mothers do. Her name is Denise. She works at a laundry. Industrial uniforms, hotel sheets, sometimes hospital linens. She leaves before sunrise most days." "And your father?" "He passed when I was little." "I'm sorry." "Thank you. What do you remember?" Annie's fingers tightened around the cup. His laugh, and the way he smelled like motor oil and peppermint gum. He drove deliveries. He used to bring home little things people forgot in trucks, not valuable things, just strange things. A red glove with no match, a keychain from Milwaukee, once a toy dinosaur with one leg missing. Margaret smiled. "A collector of lost things. That's what my mom called him. And you want to become a nurse?" "Yes." "Why?" Annie could have given the answer she used in school interviews. "I want to help people. I am passionate about patient care. I believe healthcare should be compassionate." Those sentences were true, but they had been polished until they no longer sounded like her. So she told Margaret the real one. "When my mom got sick once, years ago, we waited in an emergency room for hours. She kept saying something was wrong. People kept saying she was anxious. She wasn't anxious. She was scared because she knew her body. I was too young to do anything except sit there and watch her be ignored." Margaret's hand stilled around her cup. "She got better," Annie said. "But I never forgot how it felt. Like we were in the room, but not really in the room. Like our fear didn't count until someone important agreed with it." Margaret looked at her for a long time. "Hospitals need nurses who remember that feeling." "That's what I think." "No, that is what you know." Annie swallowed and looked away before her eyes could betray her. Margaret reached for her hand, not gripping this time, only resting her fingers over Annie's. "Last night, when the chair started moving, I was not Mrs. Whitmore. I was not Richard's mother. I was just an old woman who could not stop herself from being carried away. You saw that. You saw me." Annie's voice came out low. "You were scared." "Yes. I know what scared looks like." "I believe you do." The door opened halfway, and Richard stepped in. then stopped when he saw them holding teacups like old friends. For once, he did not bring the room with him. No assistant, no call, no file folder pressed under his arm. "I'm interrupting," he said. "You are," Margaret replied, "but we will forgive you if you behave." Annie started to stand. Richard lifted a hand. "Please don't get up." She sat back slowly. He looked at the tray. "Mother, are you feeding hospital staff cookies now?" "I am feeding my guest. There is a difference." Richard accepted that without argument and took the chair near the bed. Maintenance confirmed the brake failure. The chair should not have been in service. Annie looked at him. "So it's official?" "It will be." Margaret heard the difference. "Will be?" "The report is being drafted." Margaret set her cup down. "Richard." He met her eyes. "It will say what happened." "Good." Annie stared at the cookie on her saucer. "Can I ask something?" "Of course," Richard said. "When the report says what happened, will it say people were there and didn't help?" Richard did not answer immediately. Annie regretted asking, but Margaret looked pleased, as if Annie had finally allowed herself to take up space. Richard said, "If witness statements support it, yes." Annie nodded. Margaret leaned back. "That is a careful answer." "It's an honest one. Careful and honest are not enemies," Margaret said. "But be sure, careful does not become cowardly." Richard looked down, almost smiling. "You're feeling better. I am feeling old and annoyed. Both are useful." Grace appeared at the door then. "Annie, breaks over in 2 minutes." Annie stood. "Thank you for the tea." Margaret squeezed her hand once. "Come again." "If I'm allowed." "You are invited," Margaret said. "Allowed is a word for people who think kindness needs paperwork." Annie smiled, more naturally this time. "I'll try." As she left, Richard walked her to the door. "Miss Carter." She paused. "I meant what I said. The report will not blame you." Annie studied his face. People say things when they feel guilty. That was the boldest thing she had said to him, and both of them seemed to notice. Richard did not look offended. "You think I feel guilty, don't you?" He glanced back at his mother. "Yes." "Then make sure the truth lasts longer than the guilt." She left before she could lose her nerve. Richard remained by the door after she was gone. Margaret lifted her tea with a small smile. "She's right, you know." Richard exhaled. "I know. No, son. You are beginning to know. That is different." Down the hall, Annie returned to the staff elevator with the taste of tea still warm in her mouth. For the first time since the ramp, she did not feel only afraid. She felt seen, and that frightened her too, because being seen meant people could either open a door or aim straight for the place where you stood. By the time Annie returned to the rehabilitation wing, the story had changed shape again. It had left the ramp, the exam room, and Margaret's tea tray, then traveled through the hospital the way all stories did, losing truth in one hallway and picking up opinion in another. At the nurse's station, Megan leaned close while pretending to organize patient folders. "People are saying Mr. Whitmore asked for your file." Annie kept her hands on the supply cart. "He told me." Megan's eyes widened. "He told you?" "Yes. That's either very good or very bad. That's what I'm afraid of." Across the desk, Helen Brooks looked up. "Carter, if you have time to chat, you have time to restock room 416. Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Megan mouthed sorry as Annie pushed the cart down the hall. Room 416 belonged to Mr. Alvarez, a retired mail carrier recovering from knee surgery. He liked his water without ice and kept the television on old westerns with the volume low. When Annie entered, he looked away from the screen and smiled. "There she is," he said, "the brave one." Annie set fresh towels on the shelf. "I'm just bringing linens, Mr. Alvarez." That's how brave people talk, always trying to make it sound like laundry. She smiled despite herself. "Do you need anything else?" "Yeah. Tell them this pudding tastes like wallpaper paste." "I'll see if we have vanilla." "Vanilla tastes like painted wallpaper paste, but thank you." That small exchange steadied her. Mr. Alvarez had no interest in hospital politics. To him, she was the girl who remembered no ice and found better pudding when she could. When she left his room, 2 visitors stood near the hallway bulletin board. One of them, a woman in a camel coat, lowered her voice too late. "That's her, isn't it? The intern? I heard she pulled Mrs. Whitmore right out of the chair. My sister said that could have paralyzed her." Annie kept walking. The other woman said, "Well, Mr. Whitmore seems grateful. Maybe she'll get a nice check out of it." Annie's hand tightened around the cart handle. She did not turn around. She had learned young that people often spoke about you differently when they thought you needed the job too much to answer. At lunch, she took her food to the staff break room, a turkey sandwich from home wrapped in foil, a bruised apple, and water from the fountain. The room smelled like reheated pasta and burnt coffee. 3 employees sat at the far table, talking quietly until Annie entered. Then the quiet became pointed. She sat alone near the vending machine. A transporter named Leon came in a minute later and nodded at her. "You holding up?" "I'm fine." He gave her the same look Grace did when she said that. "I saw the ramp this morning. If that chair had hit the wall with Mrs. Whitmore in it, everybody would be singing a different tune. Some people already are." Leon opened the refrigerator and took out a plastic container. "That's because it's easier to judge somebody after they did the hard part." Annie unwrapped her sandwich. "Did you hear people saying I'm after money?" He paused. "You want me to lie?" "No." "Then yes, I heard it." She stared at the bread in her hands. "I didn't even know who she was. Doesn't matter to folks who need a story that makes them comfortable." Before Annie could answer, Helen walked in with a folder under her arm. The room shifted. Leon suddenly became very interested in his lunch. "Carter," Helen said, "administration wants your written statement typed and submitted through the incident portal before end of shift. I gave Nurse Miller a written statement last night. This one needs to be official." "Okay. And keep it factual. No assumptions, no comments about bystanders, no opinions about the break." Annie set her sandwich down. "The break didn't hold. Maintenance will determine that." Mr. Whitmore said maintenance confirmed it. Helen's jaw moved slightly. "Mr. Whitmore is not your supervisor." "No, Mom." "Then follow instructions from the people who are." Leon looked down into his container, but Annie could feel him listening. Helen continued. "Also, you are not to visit Mrs. Whitmore again unless assigned or cleared through the charge nurse." Annie nodded. "Nurse Miller said it was cleared today. Going forward, clear it through me." The instructions sounded simple. The meaning was not. "Yes, ma'am." Helen left, and the break room stayed still for a few seconds after the door closed. Leon exhaled. "She always that warm?" Annie gave him a tired look. "Sorry," he said. "Bad joke." "It's okay." "No, it's not." He sat across from her. "Listen, don't let them make you put less truth in that report just because truth makes somebody's shoes tight." Annie picked at the edge of the foil. "If I mention the people who didn't help, they'll say I'm being emotional." "Were they there?" "Yes." "Did they help?" "No." "Then that's not emotion. That's sequence." Annie looked at him, and for the first time that day, she felt less alone. After lunch, she went to the small computer station near the rehab office and opened the incident portal. The form asked for time, location, patient involved, staff involved, actions taken, witnesses, environmental factors, equipment involved, and narrative summary. Witnesses. She stared at the field for a long moment. Then she typed carefully. Several visitors and staff were present in the hallway or nearby at the time the patient called for help. I cannot identify all names. I heard the patient state that the brakes were broken and observed the wheelchair moving down the ramp. I attempted to stop the wheelchair from behind. The wheelchair did not stop. I moved alongside the chair, instructed the patient to look at me and give me her hand, then assisted her out of the chair before the chair reached the bottom of the ramp. The empty wheelchair continued down the ramp and stopped near the garden doors. She did not write that people stood watching. She did not write that they became experts after danger passed. Then she heard Grace's voice in her memory. Administration can determine font size. They don't get to determine your memory. Annie moved the cursor back to the witness section and added one sentence. Some bystanders were close enough to observe but did not physically assist before the patient was removed from the wheelchair. She sat back, heart beating harder than typing a sentence should have made it beat. "Carter." Helen stood behind her. Annie nearly jumped. "Yes, ma'am?" Helen's eyes moved to the screen. "Are you done?" "Almost." Helen read enough to see the added sentence. Her expression cooled. "That line is unnecessary. It's what happened. It sounds accusatory. It's factual. You don't know why people didn't assist." "I didn't write why. I wrote that they didn't." Helen looked at her for a long second. "You need to decide whether you want to be known as a good student or a difficult one." The words landed clean and hard. Annie's first instinct was to delete the sentence. She could feel the old habit rise in her. Make it easier for them. Make it smaller. Keep the door open. Don't give anyone a reason. Then she thought of Margaret on the floor, saying, "Stronger this time. She saved me." That is what happened. She thought of her mother's note. "Don't shrink. I want to be accurate," Annie said. Helen leaned closer. "Accuracy includes judgment. Then I'll let risk management judge it." The silence between them sharpened. Before Helen could respond, Richard Whitmore's voice came from the hallway. "That seems appropriate." Both women turned. Richard stood near the office entrance, not close enough to be accused of hovering, but close enough to have heard the last exchange. He wore a dark overcoat now, and behind him was a woman with a tablet who looked like she had never lost a document in her life. Helen straightened. "Mr. Whitmore, I didn't realize you were on the unit. I'm meeting with facilities in 10 minutes. His eyes moved to the computer screen, then back to Annie. "Miss Carter, are you submitting your statement?" "Yes, sir." "Good," Helen said. "I was only advising her to keep the language neutral." Richard nodded. "Neutral is useful when facts are unclear." Here, the chair had a documented brake issue. The patient called out that the brakes were failing, and Miss Carter acted. "I'd prefer the statement not be edited into politeness." Helen's face held professional calm, but Annie could see strain at the edges. "Of course." Richard looked at Annie. "Do not change what you saw to make someone else comfortable." Annie held his gaze, surprised by how closely his words matched what Leon had said. "Yes, sir." He gave a small nod and turned to leave, then paused. "And Miss Carter?" "Yes? My mother asked whether you like chicken soup or tomato soup." Annie blinked. "What?" "She says hospital food is no way to thank anyone, but she is limited by medical supervision." For the first time all day, Annie laughed before she could stop herself. It was small, but real. "Chicken," she said. Richard nodded with the seriousness of a man receiving board instructions. "Chicken." When he left, Helen closed the folder in her hands. She did not look at Annie. "Submit the report and return to the desk." "Yes, ma'am." Annie clicked submit before she could lose courage. The rest of the afternoon passed with fewer words. Helen gave instructions. Annie followed them. Visitors glanced. Staff whispered. But something had shifted. Not enough to protect her from every look or every rumor, but enough for Annie to feel the floor under her feet again. Near the end of her shift, she stopped by Mr. Alvarez's room with vanilla pudding. He looked at the cup. "Painted wallpaper? Fresh from the fridge. Bless you." She adjusted his blanket and checked his water. "You look tired," he said. "I am. Good people usually are." Annie smiled. "My mom says that too. Then your mom is smart." "She is." As Annie left, her phone buzzed. A message from Denise waited on the screen. "How was today?" Annie typed, then erased, then typed again. "Hard, but I didn't shrink." The reply came a minute later. "That's my girl." Annie stood in the hallway with the phone in her hand, letting those 3 words settle somewhere deeper than the rumors could reach. At the far end of the corridor, Richard entered a conference room with facilities, managers, and administrators. Through the glass, Annie saw men in suits shift in their chairs as he placed a file on the table. She could not hear what he said, but she saw the way their faces changed. For once, someone powerful was asking questions in the right direction. Annie tucked her phone away, pushed the linen cart toward the elevator, and kept walking. The hospital still felt large. The whispers had not stopped. Helen had not softened. But Margaret knew her name, Grace had her back, and the truth, at least for one day, had survived being edited. Richard did not sit when he entered the conference room. That was the first thing the facilities managers noticed. He placed the file on the table, removed his overcoat, and stood at the head of the room while 6 people shifted in their chairs and pretended not to be nervous. The unit manager was there, along with the director of facilities, a risk management officer, a maintenance supervisor, and 2 administrators whose names Richard had seen on emails but never needed to remember. Helen Brooks stood near the wall with her tablet held against her chest. On the screen at the end of the room was a paused image from the hallway camera. The angle was high and wide. The ramp looked less steep than it had felt in the moment. Margaret's wheelchair was halfway down. Annie was a blur moving toward it. Richard looked at the image longer than anyone expected. "Play it," he said. The risk officer clicked the laptop. The video moved silently. Margaret's chair drifted, then rolled faster. Several people turned their heads. One man stepped back. A woman lifted her hands to her mouth. Annie appeared from the side of the frame, dropped the towels, and ran. She grabbed the chair, struggled with it, slipped, then moved alongside it and pulled Margaret clear before the wheelchair hit the stopper and tipped. The video ended. No one spoke. Richard looked at the screen. Again, they watched it a second time. This time, Richard watched the bystanders. The woman with the coffee cup took 3 steps forward, then stopped. The man in the brown coat raised his phone. One orderly appeared at the far end but did not run until after Annie and Margaret were already on the floor. The older man in the navy sweater moved aside to avoid the chair's path. Richard kept his voice even. How many people in that hallway were closer to my mother than the linen room? The risk officer cleared her throat. It depends how we measure distance. Measure it however makes you comfortable. She glanced at the screen. At least 3. At least 3, Richard repeated. And the person who reached her was the intern coming out of linen supply. The director of facilities leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, we are not minimizing what happened. The chair should have been removed from circulation. We are still reviewing why the replacement order was delayed. Richard opened the file. It was flagged 3 weeks ago. Yes, marked usable with caution. The director swallowed. That language is part of our internal equipment status system. Was my mother told she was sitting in a chair marked usable with caution? No. Was the nurse who brought the chair told? I don't believe so. Was anyone told in a way that required action? The room tightened. The maintenance supervisor shifted in his seat. We were short on replacement chairs. Rehab had 2 others out for repair, and this one passed basic movement checks. Richard turned to him. Did it pass brake resistance testing? The man hesitated. Not fully. Then it did not pass. The risk officer said, we should be careful with wording until the formal report is complete. Richard looked at her. The wording failed before the brake did. No one answered. Helen's tablet screen dimmed. She tapped it awake just to have something to do. Richard turned toward her. Nurse Brooks, were you aware Annie Carter was advised to remove a factual witness statement from her report? Helen's face remained controlled. I advised her to avoid language that could be interpreted as accusatory. She wrote that bystanders were present and did not physically assist. Is that inaccurate? I did not say it was inaccurate. Then why ask her to soften it? Because incident reports are not the place for emotional interpretation. Richard nodded toward the screen. That video does not look emotional to me. It looks like sequence. Helen said nothing. The unit manager stepped in. Mr. Whitmore, I think everyone agrees the intern responded quickly. The concern is that emergency patient handling requires training. Richard looked at her. If she had waited for trained staff, what would the outcome likely have been? The room went quiet again. Grace Miller entered without knocking, carrying a printed nursing note. Several people looked up in surprise. Richard had asked her to attend, but apparently no one else had been told. Sorry I'm late, Grace said. The 4th floor needed a nurse, and unlike some meetings, patients do not pause for scheduling. Richard gestured to the chair beside the door. Thank you for coming. Grace remained standing. I'm fine here. The risk officer looked uncomfortable. Nurse Miller. This is an administrative review. Good. I brought administration some nursing. Richard almost smiled, but did not. Grace placed her note on the table. Mrs. Whitmore was frightened, alert, and able to state clearly that the brakes failed. Annie Carter attempted to stop the chair before removing the patient. The patient remained conscious and oriented after the event. No acute injury noted at initial assessment. That is my record. The unit manager read the first line. Thank you. Grace did not move. And since we are reviewing, I'd like to add that Annie should not be treated like a liability because she did what the rest of the hallway didn't. Helen looked at her. No one is treating her that way. Grace turned. You entered a note about emotional decision-making. She needs reinforcement on scope. She needs a hospital that doesn't hand elderly patients broken chairs. The sentence hit harder because Grace did not raise her voice. Richard closed the file. Here is what will happen. Every wheelchair, transport chair, walker, bed brake, and patient mobility device in this hospital will be inspected before the next shift change. Anything that does not pass full safety testing is removed from use immediately. No usable with caution. No pending parts in patient areas. If we do not have enough equipment, We buy more by morning. The facilities director nodded quickly. We can implement that. You will implement it? Yes, sir. Richard turned to the risk officer. The final report will include the equipment history, the delayed repair, the video timeline, and Mrs. Whitmore's statement. It will also reflect that Annie Carter's intervention prevented likely injury. The risk officer chose her words carefully. That phrasing may create legal exposure. The exposure was created on the ramp. The phrasing will tell the truth. Grace's mouth twitched, but she stayed silent. Richard continued, any negative note in Miss Carter's training file related to this incident is frozen until reviewed by Dr. Patel, Nurse Miller, and the training coordinator. Not just her direct supervisor. Helen's shoulders stiffened. That is unusual. So was watching an intern save my mother from our equipment failure. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, but the important part had already happened. People began writing things down. Tasks were assigned, deadlines were set. The word liability gave way to safety, then to accountability, then to inspection. Richard knew language could be used to hide truth, but it could also force people to carry it. When the meeting ended, Grace stepped into the hallway beside him. You thundered, she said. Quietly? Less quietly than you think. Was I wrong? No. She tucked her note under her arm. But remember what your mother said. Don't make Annie into a banner without asking if she wants to be one. I'm trying not to. Good. Try harder. Downstairs, Annie had no idea the conference room had spent nearly an hour saying her name. She was in room 416, helping Mr. Alvarez argue with a cup of vanilla pudding. I told you, he said, holding up the spoon. Painted wallpaper. You ate half of it. I'm a man of hope. Annie laughed and adjusted his bedside table. Do you want me to see if they have chocolate? Now you're speaking English. She wrote a note on his meal card and turned to leave when Megan appeared at the doorway. Annie, Megan whispered, they're inspecting every wheelchair in the building. Annie blinked. All of them? Every one. Facilities is running around like somebody set their pants on fire. Mr. Alvarez pointed his spoon. Good. About time. My chair squeaks like a haunted shopping cart. Annie looked down the hallway. 2 maintenance workers were already moving past with clipboards, checking brake locks, wheel tension, footrests, and identification tags. A cart near the nurse's station held red out-of-service labels. Helen stood at the desk, speaking with the unit manager. Her face was unreadable. Annie returned to the supply area, but she moved slower now. The hospital seemed different when people were checking things they had ignored that morning. She passed one wheelchair with a red tag hanging from the handle. Another was being rolled away by a maintenance worker who looked annoyed but focused. Grace found her near the therapy room. You see the parade? Grace asked. Yes. That started in the conference room. Mr. Whitmore? Among others. Annie touched the edge of a red tag on the chair beside her. So it really was broken? Yes. They kept using it anyway? Grace's face softened. Looks that way. Annie looked toward the ramp corridor. The yellow caution sign was still there. If Mrs. Whitmore had been someone else, would they be doing all this? Grace did not rush to answer. Maybe not this fast. That's what I thought. It's ugly, but it can still be used for good. Annie looked at her. That doesn't make it fair. No, Grace said. Justice doesn't always arrive fair. Sometimes it shows up late, wearing the wrong shoes, and you have to make it work before it leaves. Annie gave a small, tired smile. You always talk like that? Only when I'm right. Near the end of the day, a message appeared on the staff board. Immediate mobility equipment, safety audit in progress. All staff must report defective equipment directly to charge nurse and facilities. No device marked for repair may remain in patient use. People stopped to read it. Some rolled their eyes. Some looked embarrassed. Some acted as if this had always been the plan. Annie read the notice twice. It did not say her name. She was glad. She did not want her face on a poster, or her story turned into a speech. But she knew what had started it. So did Helen. So did Grace. So did Richard Whitmore, wherever he was in the building. Annie stepped into the hallway near the garden ramp before leaving. The floor had been dried. A maintenance cone stood beside the wall. The black mark from the wheelchair was faint but still visible near the stopper. She stood there a moment, remembering Margaret's hand in hers and the weight of strangers' eyes after the danger had passed. Richard approached from the opposite end of the hall, slowing when he saw her. He did not crowd her this time. "Miss Carter, Mr. Whitmore." He looked at the ramp, then at the safety notice posted nearby. The chair should never have been there. Annie nodded. "No, sir, it shouldn't have. I'm sorry." She looked at him, surprised by the plainness of it. "For the equipment," he said. "For the questions. For the way people made you defend yourself before they checked the facts." Annie held the strap of her bag. "Thank you. I don't expect that to fix it." "It doesn't." He nodded. "Fair." She looked at the ramp again. "But it helps that someone finally looked." Richard followed her gaze to the black mark. "My mother says seeing people is the beginning of responsibility." She sounds like a teacher. She was. That makes sense. They stood without speaking for a moment. Then Annie said, "I should catch my bus." "Of course." She started to leave, then stopped. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes?" "Please don't let them only fix the chairs on the VIP floor." Richard looked at her for a long second. "I won't." Annie nodded once and walked toward the staff exit. Behind her, Richard remained by the ramp. He watched a maintenance worker push another wheelchair past, stop, test the brakes twice, and attach a green inspection tag to the handle. It was a small thing. A tag, a checked brake, a chair that would hold. But Richard was beginning to understand that in a hospital, small things were often the line between dignity and disaster. And the person who had reminded him of that was not a consultant, not a board member, not one of his executives. It was Annie Carter, carrying a bus pass in her pocket, asking him to remember the people who would never make it to the VIP floor. Annie missed the first bus by less than a minute. She saw its red taillights pull away from the curb just as she stepped out of the staff entrance, her coat half-buttoned and her bag sliding from one shoulder. For a moment she only stood there, too tired to be angry, watching the bus turn the corner and disappear into the Chicago evening. The next one would come in 23 minutes. She pulled her coat tighter and sat under the shelter, where old salt crusted the concrete and a cracked advertisement for a dental clinic curled at one edge. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Mom, you on your way?" Annie typed back, "Missed the bus. Coming soon." Denise replied, "I saved you dinner." Annie smiled at that. Saved you dinner meant a plate wrapped in foil on the stove, probably chicken thighs, rice, and whatever greens Denise had found on sale. It meant her mother had worked all day and still made sure Annie came home to something warm. A second message came, "Denise, and don't say you're not hungry." Annie laughed softly, then slipped the phone away. The cold worked its way through her shoes while she waited. Her arm still felt sore, not badly, but enough to remind her every time she moved. She thought about Richard standing by the ramp, apologizing without trying to decorate the apology. She thought about the red tags on the broken chairs, the maintenance workers testing brakes, and the notice on the staff board. Something had changed, but she did not yet know if it would last. That was the thing about hospitals. A policy could appear in one afternoon and disappear into old habits by spring. When the bus finally came, Annie climbed aboard and took a seat near the middle. The windows were fogged. A little boy in a puffy coat slept against his grandmother 2 rows ahead. A man in work boots rubbed his hands together, his lunch cooler tucked between his feet. Annie watched them and thought of what she had said to Richard. "Please, don't let them only fix the chairs on the VIP floor." She had not meant to sound bold. She had meant to sound honest. At home, Denise was waiting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the patience of a woman who knew her daughter would try to hide half the truth. "Sit," Denise said. Annie hung up her coat. "You say that a lot, and yet you still act surprised." The plate on the stove held baked chicken, rice, collard greens, and a biscuit wrapped in a paper towel. Annie warmed it in the microwave while Denise watched her with narrowed eyes. "You're moving stiff." "I'm okay. That phrase is starting to irritate me." Annie brought the plate to the table and sat. "They checked all the wheelchairs today." Denise leaned back. "All of them?" "That's what they said. Mr. Whitmore told them, not just the VIP floor." Denise nodded slowly. "Good. They found the chair had been flagged weeks ago." Her mother's expression hardened. "So they knew. Somebody knew. Or a system knew. I don't know how they say it when nobody wants to be the somebody." Denise was quiet for a moment. "A system is just people standing far enough apart to pretend their hands are clean." Annie looked at her. "You should put that on a church bulletin." "I might." Annie ate a few bites. The food helped more than she expected. The warmth, the salt, the familiar taste of greens with vinegar. All day she had felt like a name being passed around by other people. At her mother's table, she became Annie again. Denise tapped the side of her mug. "Did anyone thank you today?" "Mrs. Whitmore did. She gave me tea." "Dia." "And cookies." Denise smiled. "Rich people cookies or regular cookies?" "Shortbread. Rich people cookies." Mr. Whitmore apologized. Denise's smile faded, but not completely. "For what?" "The chair, the questions, people making me defend myself." "Did he mean it?" "I think so." "You trust him?" Annie took longer with that answer. "I trust that he loves his mother." "That's not the same." "No." Denise reached across the table and touched Annie's wrist. "Careful near the bandage." "Then keep your eyes open. Gratitude can be real, and power can still be clumsy." Annie nodded. "Grace said something like that." "Grace is smart." "She is." After dinner, Annie opened her laptop at the kitchen table to study. The anatomy chapter blurred after 10 minutes. She read the same paragraph about nerve pathways 3 times and remembered none of it. Finally, she opened her student portal instead. The tuition balance sat there waiting, blunt as a locked door. Due before next term. She stared at the number. It was not a billionaire's number. It was not even a hospital donor's number. It was the kind of number that ruined ordinary people quietly. Too much for Denise to cover. Too much for extra shifts at the diner on weekends. Too much to ignore. Denise saw her face from the sink. "School? Yeah. How bad?" Annie almost said fine. Then she stopped. "Bad enough." Denise dried her hands on a towel and came to stand behind her. For a long moment, neither spoke. "We'll figure it out," Denise said. Annie closed the laptop halfway. "Mom, you always say that, because we always do. Sometimes figuring it out means you work more." Denise's voice softened. "That is my choice. It shouldn't have to be." "No, but don't start carrying my part and yours both. That's how backs bend before their time." Annie turned the laptop toward her. "If I can't pay before next term, I might have to pause." Denise read the number and inhaled slowly. There it was. Not panic, not surprise. Just a mother measuring the distance between love and money. "We'll call the financial aid office," Denise said. "I already did last week. They said there's nothing else available right now." "There is always something else. Somebody just has to care enough to look." Annie thought of Richard's words in the hallway. "I won't." She thought of Margaret's hand over hers. She wondered what those people would say if they knew how close she was to losing the future they kept praising her for. But she did not want to ask. Asking made kindness feel like a bill. Asking made people look at you differently. "I don't want anyone at the hospital knowing," Annie said. Denise looked at her for a long moment. "Because you think they'll say you helped that woman for money." Annie did not answer. Denise pulled out the chair beside her and sat. "Baby, people who want to think small will think small with or without evidence." "I know, but I understand." Denise touched the closed laptop. "Pride can keep you standing. It can also keep you outside a door that someone would have opened." Annie looked down. "I don't know the difference. Most of us learn after losing too much." The next morning, Annie arrived early enough not to miss the staff briefing. Helen gave assignments without mentioning the incident. That almost felt worse. The silence around it had a shape. Near mid-morning, an email popped up on the unit computer reminding staff of mandatory mobility equipment checks. Megan read it over Annie's shoulder. "They're serious." "For now," Annie said. Megan lowered her voice. "You think they'll keep doing it?" "I hope so." At 11, Grace found Annie in the supply closet counting gate belts. "You got a minute?" Annie looked up. "Did I do something?" "One day you're going to stop asking that first." "Not today." Grace stepped inside and lowered her voice. "Margaret asked for you again, but that's not why I'm here. You look like you slept with a textbook on your chest. That obvious?" "To me, yes." Annie went back to counting. "I have tuition due." Grace did not speak right away. "How much?" Annie shook her head. "I shouldn't have said anything." "Annie, I don't want it getting around. It won't get around from me." Annie kept her eyes on the shelf. "Enough that I might have to pause school." Grace's face changed, not with pity, but with recognition. "I had to pause once. You did? Second year. My mother got sick. I told myself I'd go back in 1 semester. Took me 4 years. Annie looked at her then. Grace nodded. That kind of pause can get teeth. I'm scared if I stop, I won't start again. That's a reasonable fear. I thought you'd tell me not to worry. I don't lie for comfort. Annie gave a tired smile. Grace leaned against the shelf. Can you apply for emergency assistance? I tried. Nothing left. Church? My mom won't ask. And I don't want her standing up there with people whispering over a collection plate. Grace understood that too well. Pride again. Dignity, Annie said. Sometimes they wear the same coat. A call light sounded down the hall. Grace straightened. Finish this. Then take your break upstairs. Margaret has been asking whether you prefer chicken soup. Annie laughed, despite the heaviness in her chest. Mr. Whitmore actually asked me that yesterday. She made him. That woman may be in a wheelchair, but she still moves men around like furniture. When Annie reached Margaret's room later, she found the old woman alone by the window with a folded newspaper on her lap. No Richard. No doctors. No administrators. Come in, Margaret said. You look tired. Everyone keeps saying that. Then perhaps everyone is right. Annie sat, but did not reach for the tea this time. Margaret noticed. What is it? Nothing. Annie Carter. The full name, spoken gently, undid her more than any hard question could have. Annie looked toward the window. My school balance is due soon. I might have to pause. Margaret did not gasp. She did not offer money. She simply listened. How long have you known? She asked. A while. And you carried it alone? My mom knows some. Not all. Margaret nodded. When I was teaching, I had students who came to school hungry but told me they'd already eaten. They were protecting their parents from embarrassment. Annie's eyes stung. Need is not shame, Margaret said. It feels like it when people already think you're reaching. Let them think, Margaret said. Their thoughts will not become your future unless you hand it to them. Annie wiped quickly beneath one eye. I don't want to be a charity story. Good. Then don't be one. Annie looked at her. Margaret reached for her hand. Be a nurse. Let the story be about that. At that moment, Richard appeared at the doorway. He had heard enough to understand. Not enough to intrude cleanly. He paused, and for once, did not enter as if every room was his to step into. Margaret looked at him. Richard, come in. Annie stiffened at once. Richard saw it and stayed near the door. I can come back. No, Margaret said. You can listen. Annie wished the floor would open, then hated herself for wishing it. Margaret's hand stayed firm over hers. Richard looked at Annie, then at his mother. What am I listening to? Margaret answered before Annie could hide again. A door closing, she said, and a girl too proud to knock. Richard did not move from the doorway. Annie wished he would either step in fully or leave, because standing there made him feel like a decision waiting to happen. Margaret, however, looked pleased with herself, as if she had just moved a stubborn chess piece exactly where it belonged. A door closing, Richard repeated. Margaret nodded toward Annie. Her tuition is due. If she cannot pay, she may have to pause school. Annie pulled her hand back gently. Mrs. Whitmore, please. Margaret, the old woman corrected, then softened. And I am not speaking to shame you. I am speaking because you did not. Richard's eyes moved to Annie. Is that true? Annie looked down at the floor. The carpet in Margaret's room was thick, pale, and clean. It looked like something that had never known bus slush or grocery stains. It's not anyone's problem here. That wasn't my question. Yes, Annie said, it's true. Richard came in slowly. Not like a man entering a room he owned, but like someone approaching a frightened animal with empty hands. He took the chair across from her instead of standing over her. How much time do you have? He asked. A few weeks. And if you don't pay, I can't register for the next term. Margaret made a small unhappy sound, but she let Annie answer. Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Have you applied for emergency aid? Yes. They said the fund is empty. Scholarships? I have a partial one. It's not enough. Loans? Annie gave a dry little smile. I'm already collecting those like hospital bracelets. Richard understood the joke, but he did not smile. And you were going to keep working, pick up extra shifts, and hope the math changed. Annie looked at him then. That's what people do. No, Margaret said. That is what people are forced to do. Annie's cheeks warmed. I didn't tell you so you'd fix it. I know, Richard said. No, I mean it. I don't want this turning into some story where the poor girl saves the rich woman and gets rescued back. Margaret's eyes softened, but she stayed quiet. Richard sat back a little. What would feel respectful? The question caught Annie off guard. Most people who wanted to help had already decided what help should look like before they offered it. I don't know, she admitted. Then I'll tell you what would not feel respectful, Richard said. A check handed to you in this room while my mother cries and I congratulate myself. Annie blinked. That was exactly what she had feared and had not known how to say. Margaret looked at her son with approval. That is a better beginning. Richard glanced at his mother. I'm trying. Continue. He turned back to Annie. The hospital foundation has education funds. Some are restricted. Some are discretionary. I can ask what is available through proper channels. Annie shook her head. If you ask, it's not proper channels. It's your name. That is fair. I don't want people saying I got special treatment because I was near your mother. Richard nodded slowly. Then it cannot be just for you. Annie paused. Margaret smiled faintly. Now he is thinking. Richard ignored that, though his mouth moved as if it wanted to answer. If the hospital failed because it ignored safety warnings, and you prevented that failure from becoming a tragedy, then the response should not be a private favor. It should be policy. Policy? Annie asked. A fund for interns and nursing students in financial danger of leaving the program. Emergency tuition support. Transportation help. Books. Clinical fees. Uniforms. Not a charity photo. An actual program. Annie held still. The words sounded too large to trust. Richard continued. Careful now. You would be eligible if you chose to apply. So would others. The criteria would be written. The process would be documented. No one could say you were handed something under a table. Margaret looked at Annie, and if anyone did say it, they would be wrong in writing. Annie almost laughed, but emotion caught in her throat. Why would you do that? Richard did not rush. Because my mother is alive because you ran. Because the equipment failed. Because this hospital almost let the person with the least power carry the most blame. And because my mother is right. If a door is closing, and I have the ability to open it without taking your dignity, I should at least try. Annie stared at her hands. She had scrubbed them that morning until her knuckles felt dry. They did not look like hands that could change hospital policy. They looked like hands that folded towels, steadied teacups, held bus rails, and counted change at corner stores. What if I say no? She asked. Then I respect it, Richard said. Margaret turned sharply. Richard, he looked at her. Mother, if respect only applies when she agrees, it is not respect. Margaret closed her mouth, then nodded. Fine. That was well said. Annoying, but well said. Annie let out a small breath. Richard said, I'd like you to think about it. Not answer now. Annie looked at him. People like you usually want answers now. People like me usually get too many answers from people who are afraid to say no. That was honest enough to make her uncomfortable. A nurse knocked and stepped in to check Margaret's vitals. The moment gave Annie somewhere to put her eyes. Margaret complained lightly about being treated like a classic car in a garage, and the nurse laughed while wrapping the cuff around her arm. Richard stood and moved aside. Annie used the pause to breathe. When the nurse left, Margaret looked tired. The conversation had taken more from her than she wanted to show. You should rest, Annie said. I am resting. I'm sitting down. That's not the same. Margaret gave Richard a sideways look. She's starting to sound like Grace. Good, Richard said. Someone should. Annie stood. I should get back before Nurse Brooks sends a search party. Richard rose too. Miss Carter. She stopped at the door. I will not move forward without telling you what I'm doing. Thank you. And I won't ask my communications team to touch this. Her shoulders loosened a little. Thank you for that too. Margaret reached out. Come here before you go. Annie returned to the bedside. Margaret took her hand in both of hers. The old woman's fingers were thin, but the hold had purpose. Need is not a stain, Margaret said. Do not let proud people, ashamed people, or cruel people teach you otherwise. Annie nodded, but the sting behind her eyes returned. Margaret squeezed once and let go. Now go and eat something that did not come from a vending machine. Annie smiled. Yes, ma'am. Margaret lifted one eyebrow. Yes, Margaret. Better. In the hallway, Richard walked beside Annie toward the elevator, far enough to avoid making her feel escorted, close enough that others noticed. Helen stood at the nurse's station. Watching, Annie felt the look but kept walking. At the elevator, Richard pressed the down button. "You didn't have to walk me," Annie said. "I know. People will talk. They already do. That doesn't make it easier." "No," he said. "It doesn't." The elevator doors opened. Annie stepped in, then turned. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes?" "If you make that fund, don't name it after me." Richard looked surprised. "Why?" "Because then people will apply for help and feel like they're walking under my story instead of their own. Just make it something plain. Something that sounds like it belongs to them." He considered that with more seriousness than she expected. "What would you call it?" Annie thought of her mother's note, Grace's coffee, Margaret's tea, Mr. Alvarez's pudding complaints, the bus riders going home tired in the dark. "The second shift fund," she said, "for people working one life while trying to build another." Richard repeated it softly. "The second shift fund." The elevator began to close. Annie held his eyes until the gap narrowed. "And if I apply, I want to fill out the same form as everybody else." "You will." The doors closed before she could decide whether she believed him. Downstairs, the rehab wing was busy with afternoon discharges. Annie returned to the supply cart, answered a call light, and found Mr. Alvarez the chocolate pudding he claimed was the only edible thing in the building. The work helped. It gave her hands something to do while her mind circled the same impossible thought. Fund. Not a gift. Not pity. A door. Near the end of her shift, Helen called her to the desk. "Carter, your break ran long." Annie checked the clock. "I was with Mrs. Whitmore. Dr. Patel approved it." Helen's lips thinned. "You'll need to make up the time." Before Annie could answer, Grace appeared behind the desk and set down a chart. She already did. Covered 416 and 418 while Megan was at lunch. Helen looked at Grace, then at Annie. "Fine." Annie said nothing. She had learned that sometimes victory was not a speech. Sometimes it was simply not being cornered alone. That evening, as she walked to the bus stop, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "Ms. Carter, this is Richard Whitmore. I spoke with the foundation chair. No action will be taken without your consent. Thank you again for speaking honestly today." Annie stood under the street lamp, reading it twice. Then she typed, "Thank you for asking first." She hesitated, then added, "Please make sure it helps students who are already tired." His reply came a minute later. "That will be the point." Annie put the phone away as the bus pulled up. She climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and watched Street Catherine shrink behind her. For the first time in weeks, the tuition balance still existed, but it did not feel like a door already closing. It felt like a door someone had finally noticed. The next morning, Annie woke before her alarm. For a few seconds, she lay still under the thin blanket, listening to the radiator knock inside the wall and the soft hiss of tires on wet pavement outside. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light Denise always left on when she went to work early. Annie reached for her phone. No new message from Richard Whitmore. She told herself she was relieved. Then she told herself to stop lying. On the kitchen table, Denise had left oatmeal in a covered bowl, a banana, and a note written on the back of an old grocery receipt. "Don't let help scare you more than hardship." Annie stood there reading it in her socks, the apartment quiet around her. Her mother had a way of saying things that made Annie feel both loved and exposed. She folded the note and slipped it into her bag beside the one from the day before. At Street Catherine, the lobby looked the same as always. Polished floors, volunteers in burgundy vests, patients checking in at the front desk, visitors carrying flowers, coffee, and worry. But Annie could feel something different beneath the routine. Near the elevators, a maintenance worker tested the brake on a transport chair before handing it to an older man's daughter. The daughter did not notice. Annie did. In the rehab wing, the safety audit had turned into clipboards, green inspection tags, and staff complaints about extra work. Megan whispered that facilities had pulled 12 chairs from service overnight. Leon said the basement looked like a wheelchair graveyard. Mr. Alvarez claimed his new chair rolled so smoothly, he might take it to Vegas. Helen Brooks remained sharp, but careful. She gave Annie assignments with no added speeches. That was not kindness. but it was quieter than before. And Annie accepted quiet where she could get it. Just after 10, Grace appeared near the supply room. "Margaret wants to see you after your break." Annie looked up from counting patient gowns. "Is she okay?" "She's better than yesterday and more stubborn than ever." "So yes." "Exactly." Annie hesitated. "Is Mr. Whitmore there?" He was. Then someone called him into a foundation meeting downstairs. Annie's stomach tightened. "About the fund?" Grace leaned against the shelf. "Most likely. I didn't think it would happen that fast. When billionaires move slow, people call it strategy. When they move fast, people call it leadership. Either way, everyone else runs behind them with folders." Annie smiled, but the worry stayed. "What if people think I asked for it?" "Some will. That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No. It's supposed to make you stop expecting fairness from gossip." Annie folded the gown more carefully than necessary. "I just don't want my name used." "You told him that. What if he forgets?" Grace looked at her. "Then remind him." Annie gave a short laugh. "You make that sound easy." "It's not easy. It's necessary." When Annie reached Margaret's room, the old woman was sitting by the window with her hair brushed neatly and a pale cardigan over her shoulders. A breakfast tray sat on the table, mostly untouched except for half a piece of toast. "You eat like someone trying to negotiate with bread," Annie said before she thought better of it. Margaret smiled. "There she is, the girl who tells the truth." "I'm sorry. Don't ruin it by apologizing." Annie sat when Margaret pointed to the chair. She had learned by now that refusing only prolonged the argument. Margaret looked at her bag. "Did you bring your schoolwork?" "A little. Anatomy notes." "Good. I like useful guests." Annie pulled out a notebook, but Margaret did not ask to see it. Instead, she watched Annie for a moment with the patient attention of a teacher waiting for a student to stop hiding the real question. "You're worried," Margaret said. "Yes." "About the fund?" "Yes." "And Richard?" Annie looked toward the door. "He means well." Margaret chuckled. "That is what women say when men are trying but still dangerous with details." Annie pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. Margaret leaned back. "He has a good heart, buried under schedules, contracts, and the belief that efficiency is a moral virtue, but he can be taught. By you? By life, if he refuses me." Annie turned her notebook in her hands. "I don't want people saying I used what happened to get money." Margaret's face grew serious. "Annie, people who stood still while I rolled down that ramp have already said enough. Do not give their voices a room inside you." "That's hard." "Yes, most necessary things are." A knock came at the door, and Richard stepped in with a folder in one hand. He paused when he saw Annie. "Good. I hoped you'd be here." Annie sat straighter. Margaret noticed but did not comment. Richard closed the door halfway, not all the way. "I spoke with the foundation chair, the hospital education office, and legal. The second shift fund can be created under the existing Workforce Development Foundation. It will support nursing students, interns, and entry-level healthcare workers at risk of leaving training because of emergency costs." Annie held very still. Richard opened the folder but did not hand it to her yet. "Tuition, books, transportation, testing fees, uniforms, childcare in some cases. Applicants will go through a standard review. No publicity requirement. No photographs. No interviews. No donor events unless the recipient chooses." Margaret lifted one finger. "And no naming Annie without consent." Richard nodded. "No naming Annie without consent." Annie looked at the folder. "How would people know it exists?" "Advisors, training coordinators, community colleges, hospital staff bulletins, churches if they already partner with our outreach programs. Quiet channels first." "That sounds better." "It can be improved," he said. "That's partly why I want you to read the draft criteria." Annie blinked. "Me? You know what students need better than the people writing the forms." "I'm not qualified to design a fund. You're qualified to know when a form is written by someone who never missed a bus." Margaret smiled into her tea. "That was almost humble, Richard." "I'm learning." He handed Annie the folder. She opened it carefully. The first page had the title, "The Second Shift Fund." Beneath it was a short purpose statement. Annie read slowly, expecting polished words that sounded kind but meant little. Instead, it said the fund was for students and healthcare trainees working while studying. especially those facing financial barriers that could interrupt education. She read the phrase twice. Interrupt education. Not fail, not drop out, not lack commitment. Interrupt. That word alone made her throat tighten. Richard watched her. Is something wrong? No, she said. That's a good word. Which one? Interrupt. She touched the page. It doesn't make it sound like the student quit, because often they don't. She looked at him then. Who wrote this? I drafted part of it. My assistant helped. Grace insulted the first version. Grace's voice came from the doorway. It deserved it. Annie turned. Grace entered with a paper cup of coffee and the look of someone who had been listening long enough to know the exact moment to appear. Richard sighed. She said my first draft sounded like a brochure for guilty rich people. It did, Grace said. This one is less embarrassing. Margaret laughed softly. Annie continued reading. The fund required a short application, proof of enrollment, a statement of need, and a recommendation from a supervisor, instructor, or community leader. Annie stopped at that line. What if the supervisor is the problem? Richard's eyes sharpened. Then we change it. Grace pointed her coffee at him. Good answer, Annie said. Some students won't ask their supervisor. They'll be scared it makes them look unreliable. Richard took a pen from his pocket. Alternative recommendations accepted. Instructor, advisor, clergy member, senior nurse, community employer, or proof of good standing without a recommendation, Annie said. Some people don't have someone safe to ask. Richard wrote that down. Margaret watched, proud and quiet. Annie turned another page. Transportation should include bus passes. It does. Not reimbursement. Some people can't pay first and wait. Richard wrote again. Direct transit cards. Books too. Same reason. Direct purchase or voucher. And uniforms, shoes, clinical supplies, testing fees, background checks, drug screening costs. People forget those. I did forget background checks, Richard said. Most people do until they can't register. He added it. Annie looked up slowly. Something in her face had changed. She was no longer only the girl receiving help. She was shaping it. Margaret saw it. So did Grace. Richard did too. And for the first time since this began, he understood what his mother meant. The point was not to rescue Annie. The point was to stop forcing young people like Annie to beg at doors they had already earned the right to enter. Richard closed his pen. Would you consider applying? Annie's guard returned, but not as high as before. If the form is the same for everyone, it will be. And if my application is reviewed by more than one person, yes. And Nurse Brooks doesn't decide. Grace coughed into her coffee. Richard nodded. She will not be part of the review. Annie looked at Margaret. I still feel strange. Margaret held out her hand. Annie took it. Of course you do, Margaret said. You have been taught that needing help is dangerous. It can be. Yes. So we make the help safer. Annie breathed in slowly. Then I'll apply. Richard did not smile too quickly. He seemed to know that celebrating might make her pull back. Thank you for trusting the process enough to try. I don't trust the process yet, Annie said. Grace muttered, smart. Annie glanced at Richard. But I trust that you're listening. That is a start, he said. Margaret squeezed Annie's hand. A very good start. Later that afternoon, Annie sat in the staff break room with the application on the table in front of her. Grace had printed it after Richard sent the revised version. The form was still new enough to have small formatting mistakes, but Annie liked that. It meant the thing was real and unfinished, like most good beginnings. Megan came in and saw the paper. What's that? A fund application? For school? Annie hesitated, then nodded. Megan sat across from her. Is it only for you? No, that's the point. It's for people who might have to stop because of money. Megan's face changed. My cousin is in CNA training. She almost quit over testing fees. Tell her to ask about it when it opens. Megan looked at the paper again. You did that? Annie shook her head. No. I just asked them not to make it useless. That counts. Annie did not answer, but the words stayed with her. When her shift ended, she brought the application home. Denise read every page at the kitchen table, lips moving slightly as she went through the details. This is real, Denise said. I think so. And you helped write it? A little. Denise looked up. Her eyes shone, but she did not cry. Denise Carter rarely cried when life required action. Your father would have said you went to work and came back with a policy. Annie laughed, then covered her face with one hand. The laugh became something close to tears, but Denise only reached over and rubbed her back. Fill it out, Denise said. What if I don't get it? Then we fight the next thing. And if I do? Denise smiled. Then you study, you sleep, you let your mama worry a little less. That night, Annie filled out the form slowly. For statement of need, she did not write a tragedy. She wrote the truth. She worked while studying. Her tuition balance could interrupt enrollment. She wanted to become a nurse because patients deserved to be believed before their fear became an emergency. At the bottom, where the form asked for goals, she paused. Then she wrote, I want to be the kind of nurse who notices before it is too late. She submitted the application just before midnight. For a long moment after, Annie sat with her hands folded over the closed laptop. Nothing in the apartment had changed. The radiator still knocked. The bills still sat in their basket. Her mother's work shoes still waited by the door. But somewhere across the city, a door that had been closing now had her name on the handle. And for once, Annie had not had to run down a ramp to reach it. The application did not vanish into silence the way Annie feared. By 10 the next morning, an email from the hospital foundation sat in her inbox, confirming that her submission had been received and would be reviewed under the new emergency education support process. It was not approval, it was not money, but it was a receipt, and for people used to being told to wait without proof, a receipt mattered. She read it once in the staff locker room, then again by the supply shelves, then a third time during break before making herself close the phone. Grace found her pretending to count blankets. You've counted that same shelf twice, Grace said. Annie looked up. Maybe I'm being thorough. Maybe you're checking your email every 6 minutes. Annie pressed her lips together. 4. Grace laughed. Progress. I know it takes time. I just hate not knowing. Everybody hates not knowing. Poor folks just have fewer cushions to land on while they wait. Annie slid the phone into her pocket. Do you think I should have said more in the application? What did you say? That I wanted to become the kind of nurse who notices before it is too late. Grace's face softened. Then you said enough. The hospital around them was learning to speak a new language, though not everyone liked the taste of it. Green inspection tags hung from wheelchairs, walkers, stretchers, and portable commodes. Red out-of-service tags appeared on anything that failed. Maintenance workers moved through the halls with clipboards and tired eyes. Nurses complained about delays, then quietly admitted the new checks had caught 2 bad wheel locks and 1 cracked footrest before a patient used them. At noon, every department received a memo from administration. It announced the mobility equipment safety audit, a new daily brake check procedure, and a no retaliation policy for reporting unsafe equipment. Staff members were instructed to remove defective devices from patient areas immediately, even if replacements were inconvenient. The last line spread through the building faster than the official notice. Patient safety is not a matter of convenience. Leon read it at the rehab desk and whistled. Somebody in a suit got religion. Megan leaned over his shoulder. Or got scared. Fear can be educational, Grace said, passing behind them with a chart. Helen Brooks stood nearby, reading the memo without expression. When she finished, she folded it once and placed it beneath her tablet. Carter, she said. Annie turned. Yes, ma'am? Room 418 needs discharge linens. After that, you'll attend the 3 o'clock training on equipment safety with the other interns. Yes, ma'am. Helen hesitated, just long enough for Annie to notice. And bring your questions if you have them. It was not an apology. It was not warmth. But it was the first instruction Helen had given her that did not sound like a warning. At 3, Annie sat in a small training room with 6 interns, 2 new nurses, and a facilities technician named Mr. Donnelly, who had grease under 1 fingernail and no patience for vague procedures. He rolled a wheelchair to the front of the room and tapped the brake with his shoe. This, he said, is not decoration. A few people laughed. I'm serious. You wouldn't put your grandmother in a car and say, the brakes work most of the time. Don't do it with a chair. He showed them how to test wheel locks, how to feel resistance, how to check footrests, how to report a loose axle, and how to tag equipment out of service. Annie listened closely, though she already knew the sound of a bad brake better than she wanted to. When Mr. Donnelly asked for a volunteer, the room went quiet. Then Annie stood. Megan looked at her with wide eyes, but Annie moved to the front. Mr. Donnelly gave her the chair and asked her to demonstrate the check. She locked the brake, pushed against the handle, checked the second wheel, leaned down to inspect the footplate, then looked at the tag. Good, he said. What else? Annie touched the wheel. If it sounds wrong when it rolls, don't ignore it just because it still moves. Mr. Donnelly nodded. Exactly. Moving is not the same as safe. Across the room, Helen watched without interrupting. After training, Annie returned to the rehab wing and found Margaret waiting near the nurse's station in a newly inspected wheelchair with a green tag looped around the handle. Grace stood behind her, and Richard stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, looking less like a visitor and more like someone trying not to take over. Margaret smiled when she saw Annie. Look at this. I have been certified roadworthy. Annie laughed. That's good to hear. Richard touched the green tag. She insisted on seeing the label herself. I am old, not ornamental, Margaret said. Grace leaned toward Annie. She also made me test the brake twice. 3 times, Margaret corrected. The first time you were humoring me. Richard looked at Annie. The new policy goes hospital-wide by Monday. All campuses after that. Annie blinked. All campuses? Yes. That's a lot. It should have been done before. Margaret looked up at him. Do not ruin a good decision by making it sound gloomy. I'm not gloomy. You have a tragic boardroom face. Grace nodded. He does. Richard ignored them both, though Annie saw the corner of his mouth move. A few minutes later, Helen approached with a folder. Mrs. Whitmore, transport is ready if you'd like to return to your room. Margaret looked at her. Nurse Brooks, Annie tells me you are supervising several students. Helen's eyes flicked to Annie. Yes, ma'am. That must be difficult work. It can be. I taught children for 41 years, Margaret said. The difficult ones were not always the loud ones. Sometimes they were the ones so afraid of being wrong that they stopped trying. Helen's posture shifted. I understand. I hope you do. A good student can be corrected without being made small. No one spoke for a moment. Annie wished she could disappear and stay at the same time. Helen looked at her then. Not kindly, exactly, but with less armor. Carter, you did well in the equipment training. Annie was so surprised she almost missed her answer. Thank you. And your incident statement was thorough. Grace's eyebrows rose. Helen added, I should not have asked you to remove a factual observation. It was quiet enough that only those near them heard it, but Annie heard every word. She held Helen's gaze. Thank you for saying that. Helen nodded once. You still need to follow scope. I know, but last night was an emergency. Yes, ma'am. Helen looked toward the green tag on Margaret's wheelchair. And emergencies are often what happen when ordinary warnings are ignored. Then she walked back to the desk. Margaret let out a satisfied breath. There. That did not kill her. Richard looked at his mother. You enjoy this too much. I enjoy progress. Progress often looks uncomfortable at first. That evening, the foundation board met in a conference room overlooking the city. Annie was not invited, which she preferred, but Richard carried her comments in the folder in front of him. The board members expected a donor-driven initiative, perhaps a small scholarship with a ribbon-cutting photograph. Richard gave them something less decorative and more expensive. The second shift fund would begin immediately. It would cover emergency education costs for healthcare trainees who were working while enrolled. It would include tuition gaps, books, transit cards, uniforms, testing fees, background checks, and clinical supplies. Applications could be supported by instructors, community leaders, senior nurses, or documentation of good standing. Supervisory approval would not be required, because some students needed help most when supervisors were part of the barrier. One board member adjusted his glasses. Richard, this is broader than a gratitude gesture. Yes, Richard said. Is that intentional? Very. Another asked. Will this be tied to the incident? No, it will be tied to the reason the incident matters. The room waited. Richard closed the folder. An unsafe chair almost hurt my mother. But after that, I watched people question the intern who saved her before they questioned the equipment that failed. That tells me we have 2 maintenance problems. One is mechanical, one is moral. The vote passed. By the next afternoon, Annie received the second. The first spring rain came to Chicago on a Thursday morning, soft enough to leave the sidewalks shining but not cold enough to turn anyone's breath white. Annie noticed it from the bus window while she held her anatomy notebook open on her lap. reading the same paragraph twice because the city kept pulling her eyes away. The gray snowbanks near the curb had finally melted. Puddles trembled under passing tires. People walked faster than they needed to, shoulders hunched, coffee cups in hand, faces turned toward whatever waited for them. Annie stepped off near Street Catherine with her backpack over one shoulder and a folded letter in the front pocket of her coat. She had read it so many times that the crease had begun to soften. Approved. That one word had been sitting in her chest for 3 days. The second shift fund had covered her tuition balance, books for next term, clinical fees, a transit pass, and the background check she had been pretending not to worry about. The email had arrived while she was helping Denise fold laundry at the kitchen table. Annie had read it once, gone quiet, then handed the phone to her mother. Denise read it, set the phone down, and covered her mouth with both hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Denise said, "Well, I guess you're going to be a nurse." Annie had cried then, not loudly, not the kind of cry that needed comforting, just enough for the pressure to leave her body. Denise pulled her close anyway and rocked her once, the way she had when Annie was small. "Your daddy would be standing in the hallway telling everybody," Denise whispered. Annie laughed through the tears. "He'd embarrass me." "Yes," Denise said, with pride. Now, walking into Street Catherine, Annie did not feel like a different person. Her shoes were the same. Her scrubs were the same. Her backpack still had a zipper that stuck if she pulled too fast. But something had shifted. The future no longer felt like a door she had to throw her shoulder against. Inside the hospital, the lobby was busy. A volunteer helped an older man find cardiology. A mother signed forms while her little girl pressed both hands against the fish tank. Near the elevators, a maintenance worker checked the brake on a wheelchair before letting a family take it. Annie stopped just long enough to notice the green inspection tag hanging from the handle. The worker looked up. "Morning." "Morning," Annie said. He tapped the tag. "Every chair, every shift now. That's good." "More paperwork," he said, but not bitterly. "But yeah, it's good." In the rehabilitation wing, the safety boards had changed. The old notices about chain of command and reporting procedures were still there, but next to them was a new sign. Mobility equipment must be checked before patient use. Report defects immediately. No retaliation for safety reports. Below that, another notice announced the first application cycle for the second shift fund. No photo, no speech, no smiling donor picture, just plain words, exactly as Annie had asked. Grace Miller found her staring at it. "Looks better without a ribbon cutting, doesn't it?" Grace said. Annie smiled. "Much better. You ready for today?" "What's today?" Grace gave her a look. "Don't play innocent." "Margaret's discharge?" Annie's smile softened. "I thought it was tomorrow." It was. Then she told Dr. Patel she had been held hostage long enough. "That sounds like her." "It does." A few minutes later, Annie stepped into Margaret's room carrying a small vase of daisies from the hospital gift shop. They were not expensive flowers, but Margaret had once said daisies looked like they had common sense. Margaret sat in a chair by the window, dressed in a cream cardigan and navy slacks. Her silver hair brushed neatly. Richard stood beside the bed, folding one of her sweaters badly into a leather overnight bag. Margaret watched him for 3 seconds. "Richard, that sweater has done nothing to deserve such treatment." He looked down at the bundle in his hands. "I'm packing. You're punishing wool." Annie laughed from the doorway. Margaret turned. "There she is." Annie held up the daisies. "For the road." Margaret's face warmed. "My favorite kind of flower." Richard took the vase. "I'll put them in water." Margaret watched him go to the sink. "He needs small tasks. Keeps him from buying companies." "I heard that," Richard said. "You were meant to." Annie moved closer. "How are you feeling?" "Old, grateful, and ready to sleep in my own bed." "That sounds healthy." "It is the healthiest I've felt all week." Richard placed the daisies on the table. "Dr. Patel said a physical therapist will come to the house 3 times a week." Grace reviewed the home safety checklist. "The wheelchair has been inspected twice." 3 times, Margaret said. "I made them do it again." Annie nodded. "Good." Richard looked at her. "You approve?" "I do." Margaret reached for Annie's hand. "And you? Did the fund come through?" Annie glanced at Richard. He said, "Only if you want to answer." That mattered, even now. Annie nodded. "It came through. Margaret squeezed her hand. Good. It helped more than me, Annie said. Megan's cousin applied for testing fees. Leon told 2 transport aides about it. Grace said 3 students already asked for forms. Richard looked pleased, but careful not to make it about himself. That's the point. Margaret looked at her son. Say the rest. He sighed softly. The foundation board approved, making it permanent for 5 years, with annual review. Annie's eyes widened. 5 years? At minimum. She looked toward the window because the room had blurred a little. That's a lot of people. Yes, Richard said. It should be. A nurse entered with the discharge papers, and Margaret signed where she was told, though not without reading every line. Richard tried to hurry her once. She raised one eyebrow, and he stopped. When the wheelchair arrived, Annie instinctively checked the brake tag before anyone asked. Richard saw it. So did Margaret. Green inspection tag, locked wheels, footrests secure. Annie crouched beside the chair. Looks good. Margaret touched her shoulder. Thank you. For checking? For remembering. The ride down to the lobby took longer than expected because Margaret insisted on saying goodbye to half the floor. Mr. Alvarez saluted her with a pudding cup from his doorway. Mrs. Whitmore, don't let them give you vanilla at home, he called. Margaret waved. I shall remain vigilant. Grace walked beside Annie near the back of the little group. You did good, she said. You keep saying that. And you keep needing to hear it. Annie smiled. Maybe. In the lobby, Denise waited near the front doors in her work uniform, having come straight from the laundry. Annie had not expected her, and the sight of her mother standing there with tired eyes and proud posture nearly undid her. Mom? Denise opened her arms. Annie went into them without thinking. Margaret watched the 2 women embrace. Then she looked at Richard, and he understood. He walked over to Denise and offered his hand. Mrs. Carter, I'm Richard Whitmore. Denise shook his hand, firm and direct. I know who you are. I owe your daughter more than I can say. Denise looked at Annie, then back at him. Then don't just say it. Keep doing right. Richard paused, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. Margaret laughed from the wheelchair. I like her. Denise smiled. I like you too, Mrs. Whitmore. You scared my child half to death. But I like you. That is fair, Margaret said. Outside. The rain had stopped. The hospital entrance smelled faintly of wet pavement and fresh air. Richard's car waited at the curb, but Margaret asked Annie to push her as far as the covered walkway. Richard looked ready to object, then thought better of it. Annie stepped behind the wheelchair. Before she moved, she locked and unlocked the brakes once, then checked them again. Margaret tilted her head back, still careful. Always. They rolled slowly toward the end of the walkway. The slope there was gentle, nothing like the ramp inside, but Annie noticed it anyway. Maybe she always would. Margaret looked out at the clearing sky. That night, you thought you were saving an old woman. Annie stopped beside her. I was. You saved my son too. Annie looked back. Richard stood a few steps away with Denise and Grace. His phone was in his coat pocket. For once, his hands were empty. He saved himself, Annie said. Margaret smiled. Perhaps, but you reminded him where to start. Richard came closer. I heard that. You were meant to, Margaret said again. Annie laughed, and this time there was no fear in it. Before Margaret left, she took Annie's hand one more time. Become the nurse you told me about. I'm trying. No, Margaret said. You are becoming. The words stayed with Annie long after Richard helped his mother into the car, long after Denise kissed Annie's cheek and went back to work, long after Grace returned upstairs to argue with a doctor about discharge timing. That afternoon, Annie went back to the rehabilitation wing. She changed linens, answered call lights, checked water cups, and listened when patients spoke. The work was the same, but she was not. On the staff board, the second shift fund notice remained pinned in place. Near the ramp to the garden, a wheelchair waited with its brakes locked and a green tag on the handle. Annie paused there before the end of her shift. The condoc was still there. It had not disappeared. It would always be possible for someone to slip, for a system to forget, for busy people to look away. But now there were checks. There were names on reports. There was a fund for students who worked one life while building another. There was a billionaire who had learned to turn off his phone. There was an old woman going home. There was a girl from Southside who no longer had to apologize for being where help was needed. Annie touched the green tag on the wheelchair, then let it go. Her bus would come in 15 minutes. Her anatomy chapter waited. Her mother had probably saved dinner again. Tomorrow would still be hard, but tomorrow was hers. She walked toward the staff exit with her backpack on her shoulder and her old white shoes squeaking softly against the clean hospital floor. Behind her, the ramp held steady, the wheelchair stayed still, and the hospital kept moving around the quiet truth one young woman had forced it to see. Kindness does not ask for a last name before it reaches out. The lesson of Annie's story is that true kindness does not stop to ask who someone is before reaching out. Annie did not know Margaret was the mother of a billionaire. She only saw an elderly woman in danger and chose to act when others stood back. Her courage reminds us that doing the right thing may not always be praised at first. And sometimes the person who helps is the one questioned the most. But quiet goodness has power. One honest act can expose what a system has ignored, restore dignity to someone overlooked, and open doors for many others. The story teaches us to notice the people around us, respect those who serve quietly, and never let fear, status, or convenience stop us from helping another human being. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.